Chapter 1 of Martin Eden by Jack London. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Martin Eden by Jack London. Chapter 1. The one opened the door with the latchkey and went in, followed by a young fellow who awkwardly removed his cap. He wore rough clothes that smacked of the sea, and he was manifestly out of place in the spacious hall in which he found himself. He did not know what to do with his cap, and was stuffing it into his coat pocket when the other took it from him. The act was done quietly and naturally, and the awkward young fellow appreciated it. He understands, was his thought. He'll see me through all right. He walked at the other's heels with a swing to his shoulders, and his legs spread unwittingly, as if the level floors were tilting up and sinking down to the heave and lunge of the sea. The wide room seemed too narrow for his rolling gait, and to himself he was in terror lest his broad shoulders should collide with the doorways, or sweep the bric-a-brac from the low mantel. He recoiled from side to side between the various objects and multiplied the hazards that in reality lodged only in his mind. Between a grand piano and a center table, piled high with books, was a space for a half a dozen to walk abreast, yet he essayed it with trepidation. His heavy arms hung loosely at his sides. He did not know what to do with those arms and hands, and when, to his excited vision, one arm seemed liable to brush against the books on the table, he lurched away like a frightened horse, barely missing the piano stool. He watched the easy walk of the other in front of him, and for the first time realized that his walk was different from that of other men. He experienced a momentary pang of shame that he should walk so uncouthly. The sweat burst through the skin of his forehead in tiny beads, and he paused and mopped his bronzed face with his handkerchief. "Hold on, Arthur, my boy," he said, attempting to mask his anxiety with facetious utterance. "This is too much all at once for yours truly. Give me a chance to get my nerve. You know I didn't want to come, and I guess your family ain't hankerin' to see me neither." "That's all right," was the reassuring answer. "You mustn't be frightened at us. We're just homely people. Hello, there's a letter for me." He stepped back to the table, tore open the envelope, and began to read, giving the stranger an opportunity to recover himself. And the stranger understood and appreciated. His was the gift of sympathy, understanding. And beneath his alarmed exterior, that sympathetic process went on. He mopped his forehead dry, and glanced about him with a controlled face, though in his eyes there was an expression such as wild animals betray when they fear the trap. He was surrounded by the unknown, apprehensive of what might happen, ignorant of what he should do, aware that he walked and bore himself awkwardly, fearful that every attribute and power of him was similarly afflicted. He was keenly sensitive, hopelessly self-conscious, and the amused glance that the other stole privily at him over the top of the letter burned into him like a dagger thrust. He saw the glance, but he gave no sign, for among the things he had learned was discipline. Also, that dagger thrust went to his pride. He cursed himself for having come, and at the same time resolved that, happen what would, having come, he would carry it through. The lines of his face hardened, and into his eyes came a fighting light. He looked about more unconcernedly, sharply observant, every detail of the pretty interior registering itself on his brain. His eyes were wide apart, nothing in their field of vision escaped, and as they drank in the beauty before them, the fighting light died out, and a warm glow took its place. He was responsive to beauty, and here was cause to respond. An oil painting caught and held him. A heavy surf thundered and burst over an outjutting rock. Lowering storm clouds covered the sky, and outside the line of surf, a pilot schooner, close-hauled, heeled over till every detail of her deck was visible, was surging along almost a stormy sunset sky. There was beauty, and it held him irresistibly. He forgot his awkward walk and came closer to the painting, very close. The beauty faded out of the canvas. His face expressed his bepuzzlement. He stared at what seemed a careless daub of paint, then stepped away. Immediately, all the beauty flashed back into the canvas. A trick picture, was his thought, as he dismissed it, though in the midst of the multitudinous impressions he was receiving, he found time to feel a prod of indignation that so much beauty should be sacrificed to make a trick. He did not know painting. He had been brought up on chromos and lithographs that were always definite and sharp, near or far. He had seen oil paintings, it was true, in the show windows of shops, but the glass of the windows had prevented his eager eyes from approaching too near. He glanced around at his friend reading the letter, and saw the books on the table. Into his eyes leaped a wistfulness and a yearning as promptly as the yearning leaps into the eyes of a starving man at the sight of food. An impulsive stride, with one lurch to the right and left of the shoulders, brought him to the table, where he began affectionately handling the books. He glanced at the titles and the authors' names, read fragments of text, caressing the volumes with his eyes and hands, and once recognized a book he had read. For the rest, they were strange books and strange authors. He chanced upon a volume of Swinburne, and began reading steadily, forgetting of where he was, his face glowing. Twice he closed the book on his forefinger, to look at the name of the author. Swinburne, he would remember that name. That fellow had eyes, and he had certainly seen color and flashing light. But who was Swinburne? Was he dead 100 years or so, like most of the poets, or was he still alive and writing? He turned to the title page. Yes, he had written other books. Well, he would go to the free library the first thing in the morning and try to get hold of some of Swinburne's stuff. He went back to the text and lost himself. He did not notice that a young woman had entered the room. The first he knew was when he heard Arthur's voice saying, "Ruth, this is Mr. Eden." The book was closed on his forefinger, and before he turned he was thrilling to the first new impression, which was not of the girl, but of her brother's words. Under that muscled body of his he was a mass of quivering sensibilities. At the slightest impact of the outside world upon his consciousness, his thoughts, sympathies, and emotions leapt and played like lambent flame. He was extraordinarily receptive and responsive, while his imagination, pitched high, was ever at work establishing relations of likeness and difference. Mr. Eden was what he had thrilled to. He who had been called Eden, or Martin Eden, or just Martin all his life, and Mr. It was certainly going some, was his internal comment. His mind seemed to turn, on the instant, into a vast camera obscura, and he saw arrayed around his consciousness endless pictures from his life, of stokeholes and forecastles, camps and beaches, jails and boozing dens, fever hospitals and slum streets, where in the thread of association was the fashion in which he had been addressed in those various situations. And then he turned and saw the girl. The phantasmagoria of his brain vanished at sight of her. She was a pale, ethereal creature, with wide, spiritual blue eyes and a wealth of golden hair. He did not know how she was dressed, except that the dress was as wonderful as she. He likened her to a pale gold flower upon a slender stem. No, she was a spirit, a divinity, a goddess. Such sublimated beauty was not of the earth. Or perhaps the books were right, and there were many such as she in the upper walks of life. She might be well sung by that chap Swinburne. Perhaps he had had somebody like her in mind when he painted that girl, Iseult, in the book there on the table. All this plethora of sight and feeling and thought occurred on the instant. There was no pause of the realities wherein he moved. He saw her hand coming out to his, and she looked him straight in the eyes as she shook his hands, frankly, like a man. The women he had known did not shake hands that way. For that matter, most of them did not shake hands at all. A flood of associations, visions of various ways he had made the acquaintance of women, rushed into his mind and threatened to swamp it. But he shook them aside and looked at her. Never had he seen such a woman. The women he had known. Immediately beside her, on either hand, ranged the women he had known. For an eternal second he stood in the midst of a portrait gallery, wherein she occupied the central place, while about her were limned many women, all to be weighed and measured by a fleeting glance, herself the unit of weight and measure. He saw the weak and sickly faces of the girls of the factories, and the simpering, boisterous girls from the south of Market. There were women of the cattle camps, and swarthy, cigarette-smoking women of old Mexico. These, in turn, were crowded out by Japanese women, doll-like, stepping mincingly on wooden clogs, by Eurasians, delicate-featured, stamped with degeneracy, by full-bodied South Sea Island women, flower-crowned and brown-skinned. All these were blotted out by a grotesque and terrible nightmare brood, frowsy, shuffling creatures from the pavements of Whitechapel, gin-bloated hags of the stews, and all the vast hells following of harpies, foul-mouthed and filthy, that under the guise of monstrous female form prey upon sailors, the scrapings of the ports, the scum and slime of the human pit. "Won't you sit down, Mr. Eden?" the girl was saying. "I have been looking forward to meeting you ever since Arthur told us. It was brave of you." He waved his hand deprecatingly, and muttered that it was nothing at all what he had done, and that any fellow would have done it. She noticed that the hand he waved was covered with fresh abrasions, in the process of healing, and a glance at the other loose-hanging hand showed it to be in the same condition. Also, with quick, critical eye, she noted a scar on his cheek, another that peeped out from under the hair of his forehead, and a third that ran down and disappeared under the starched collar. She repressed a smile at sight of the red line that marked the chafe of the collar against the bronzed neck. He was evidently unused to stiff collars. Likewise, her feminine eye took in the clothes he wore, the cheap and unaesthetic cut, the wrinkling of the coat across the shoulders, and the series of wrinkles in the sleeves that advertised bulging biceps muscles. While he waved his hand and muttered that he had done nothing at all, he was obeying her behest by trying to get into a chair. He found time to admire the ease with which she sat down, then lurched toward a chair facing her, overwhelmed with consciousness of the awkward figure he was cutting. This was a new experience for him. All his life up to then he had been unaware of being either graceful or awkward. Such thoughts of self had never entered his mind. He sat down gingerly on the edge of the chair, greatly worried by his hands. They were in the way wherever he put them. Arthur was leaving the room, and Martin Eden followed his exit with longing eyes. He felt lost, alone there in the room with that pale spirit of a woman. There was no barkeeper upon whom to call for drinks, no small boy to send around the corner for a can of beer, and by means of that social fluid start the amenities of friendship flowing. "You have such a scar on your neck, Mr. Eden," the girl was saying. "How did it happen? I'm sure it must have been some adventure." "A Mexican with a knife, miss," he answered, moistening his parched lips and clearing his throat. "It was just a fight. After I got the knife away, he tried to bite off my nose." Badly as he had stated it, in his eyes was a rich vision of that hot, starry night in Salina Cruz, the white strip of beach, the lights of the sugar steamers in the harbor, the voices of the drunken sailors in the distance, the jostling stevedores, the flaming passion in the Mexican's face, the glint of the beast eyes in the starlight, the sting of the steel in his neck, and the rush of blood. The crowd and the cries, the two bodies, his and the Mexican's, locked together, rolling over and over and tearing up the sand, and from away off somewhere, the mellow tinkling of a guitar. Such was the picture, and he thrilled to the memory of it, wondering if the man could paint it who had painted the pilot schooner on the wall. The white beach, the stars, and the lights of the sugar steamers would look great, he thought, and midway on the sand the dark group of figures that surrounded the fighters. The knife occupied a place in the picture, he decided, and would show well, with a sort of gleam in the light of the stars. But of all this no hint had crept into his speech. He tried to bite off my nose," he concluded. "Oh," said the girl in a faint, far voice, and he noticed the shock in her sensitive face. He felt a shock himself, and a blush of embarrassment shone faintly on his sunburned cheeks, though to him it burned as hotly as when his cheeks had been exposed to the open furnace door in the fire-room. Such sordid things as stabbing a phrase were evidently not fit subjects for conversation with a lady. People in the books, in her walk of life, did not talk about such things. Perhaps they did not know about them either. There was a brief pause in the conversation they were trying to get started. Then she asked tentatively about the scar on his cheek. Even as she asked, he realized that she was making an effort to talk his talk, and he resolved to get away from it and talk hers. "It was just an accident," he said, putting his hand to his cheek. "One night in a calm, with a heavy sea running, the main boom lift carried away, and next the tackle. The lift was wire, and it was threshing around like a snake. The whole watch was trying to grab it, and I rushed and got swatted." "Oh," she said, this time with an accent of comprehension, though secretly his speech had been so much Greek to her, and she was wondering what a lift was and what swatted meant. "This man Swinburne," he began, attempting to put his plan into execution and pronouncing the I long. "Who?" "Swinburne," he repeated, with the same mispronunciation. "The poet." "Swinburne," she corrected. "Yes, that's the chap," he stammered, his cheeks hot again. "How long since he died?" "Why, I haven't heard that he was dead." She looked at him curiously. "Where did you make his acquaintance?" "I never clapped eyes on him," was the reply. "But I read some of his poetry out of that book there on the table, just before you come in. How do you like his poetry?" And thereat she began to talk quickly and easily upon the subject he had suggested. He felt better, and settled slightly from the edge of the chair, holding tightly to its arms with his hands, as if it might get away from him and buck him to the floor. He had succeeded in making her talk, and while she rattled on, he strove to follow her, marveling at all the knowledge that was stowed away in that pretty head of hers, and drinking in the pale beauty of her face. Follow her he did, though bothered by unfamiliar words that fell glibly from her lips, and by critical phrases and thought processes that were foreign to his mind, but that nevertheless stimulated his mind and set it tingling. Here was intellectual life, he thought, and here was beauty, warm and wonderful as he had never dreamed it could be. He forgot himself and stared at her with hungry eyes. Here was something to live for, to win to fight for, aye, and die for. The books were true. There were such women in the world. She was one of them. She lent wings to his imagination, and great, luminous canvases spread themselves before him, whereon loomed vague, gigantic figures of love and romance, and on heroic deeds for woman's sake, for a pale woman, a flower of gold. And through the swaying, palpitant vision, as though a fairy mirage, he stared at the real woman, sitting there and talking of literature and art. He listened as well, but he stared, unconscious of the fixity of his gaze, or of the fact that all that was essentially masculine in his nature was shining in his eyes. But she, who knew so little of the world of men, being a woman, was keenly aware of his burning eyes. She had never had men look at her in such fashion, and it embarrassed her. She stumbled and halted in her utterance. The thread of argument slipped from her. He frightened her, and at the same time it was strangely pleasant to be so looked upon. Her training warned her of peril, and of wrong, subtle, mysterious luring, while her instincts rang clarion-voiced through her being, impelling her to hurdle caste and place, and gain to this traveler from another world, to this uncouth young fellow with lacerated hands and a line of raw red caused by the unaccustomed linen at his throat, who, all too evidently, was soiled and tainted by ungracious existence. She was clean, and her cleanness revolted, but she was a woman, and she was just beginning to learn the paradox of woman. As I was saying, what was I saying? She broke off abruptly and laughed merrily at her predicament. You were saying that this man Swinburne failed being a great poet because, and that was as far as you got, miss, he prompted, while to himself he seemed suddenly hungry, and delicious little thrills crawled up and down his spine at the sound of her laughter. Like silver, he thought to himself, like tinkling silver bells, and on the instant, and for an instant, he was transported to a far land, where under pink cherry blossoms he smoked a cigarette and listened to the bells of the peaked pagoda, calling straw-sandaled devotees to worship. Yes, thank you, she said. Swinburne fails, when all is said, because he is, well, indelicate. There are many of his poems that should never be read. Every line of the really great poets is filled with beautiful truth, and calls to all that is high and noble in the human. Not a line of the great poets can be spared, without impoverishing the world by that much. I thought it was great, he said hesitatingly. The little I read. I had no idea he was such a scoundrel. I guess that crops out in his other books. There are many lines that could be spared from the book you were reading, she said, her voice primly firm and dogmatic. I must have missed 'em, he announced. What I read was the real goods. It was all lighted up and shining, and it shone right to me and lighted me up inside, like the sun or a searchlight. That's the way it landed on me, but I guess I ain't up much on poetry, miss. He broke off lamely. He was confused, painfully conscious of his inarticulateness. He had felt the bigness and glow of life in what he had read, but his speech was inadequate. He could not express what he felt, and to himself he likened himself to a sailor in a strange ship on a dark night, groping about in the unfamiliar running rigging. Well, he decided, it was up to him to get acquainted in this new world. He had never seen anything that he couldn't get the hang of when he wanted to, and it was about time for him to want to learn to talk the things that were inside of him so that she could understand. She was bulking large on his horizon. Now Longfellow, she was saying. Yes, I've read him, he broke in impulsively, spurred on to exhibit and make the most of his little store of book knowledge, desirous of showing her that he was not wholly a stupid clod. That Psalm of Life, Excelsior, and I guess that's all. She nodded her head and smiled, and he felt somehow that her smile was tolerant, pitifully tolerant. He was a fool to attempt to make a pretense that way. That Longfellow chap most likely had written countless books of poetry. Excuse me, miss, for buttin' in this way. I guess the real facts is that I don't know nothin' much about such things. It ain't in my class, but I'm goin' to make it in my class. It sounded like a threat. His voice was determined. His eyes were flashing, and the lines of his face had grown harsh. And to her it seemed that the angle of his jaw had changed. Its pitch had become unpleasantly aggressive. At the same time, a wave of intense virility seemed to surge out from him and impinge upon her. I think you could make it in your class, she finished with a laugh. You are very strong. Her gaze rested for a moment on the muscular neck, heavy-corded, almost bull-like, bronzed by the sun, spilling over with rugged health and strength. And though he sat there, blushing and humble, again she felt drawn to him. She was surprised by a wanton thought that rushed into her mind. It seemed to her that if she could lay her two hands upon that neck, that all its strength and vigor would flow out to her. She was shocked by this thought. It seemed to reveal to her an undreamed depravity in her nature. Besides, strength to her was a gross and brutish thing. Her ideal of masculine beauty had always been slender gracefulness. Yet the thought still persisted. It bewildered her that she should desire to place her hands on that sunburned neck. In truth, she was far from robust, and the need of her body and mind was for strength. But she did not know it. She knew only that no man had ever affected her before, as this one had, who shocked her from moment to moment with his awful grammar. Yes, I ain't no invalid, he said. When it comes down to hard pan, I can digest scrap iron. But just now I've got dyspepsia. Most of what you was sayin' I can't digest. Never trained that way, you see. I like books and poetry, and what time I've had I've read 'em, but I never thought about 'em the way you have. That's why I can't talk about 'em. I'm like a navigator adrift on a strange sea, without chart or compass. Now I want to get my bearin's. Maybe you can put me right. How did you learn all this you've been talkin'?" "By going to school, I fancy, and by studying," she answered. "I went to school when I was a kid," he began to object. "Yes, but I mean high school and lectures and the university." "You've gone to the university?" he demanded in frank amazement. He felt that she had become remoter from him by at least 1,000,000 miles. "I'm going there now. I'm taking special courses in English." He did not know what English meant, but he made a mental note of that item of ignorance and passed on. "How long would I have to study before I could go to the university?" he asked. She beamed encouragement upon his desire for knowledge and said, "That depends upon how much studying you have already done. You have never attended high school, of course not. But did you finish grammar school?" "I had 2 years to run when I left," he answered, "but I was always honorably promoted at school." The next moment, angry with himself for the boast, he had gripped the arms of the chair so savagely that every finger end was stinging. At the same moment he became aware that a woman was entering the room. He saw the girl leave her chair and trip swiftly across the floor to the newcomer. They kissed each other, and, with arms around each other's waists, they advanced toward him. That must be her mother, he thought. She was a tall, blonde woman, slender and stately, and beautiful. Her gown was what he might expect in such a house. His eyes delighted in the graceful lines of it. She and her dress together reminded him of women on the stage. Then he remembered seeing similar grand ladies in gowns entering the London theatres when he stood and watched, and the policeman shoved him back into the drizzle beyond the awning. Next his mind leaped to the Grand Hotel of Yokohama, where, too, from the sidewalk, he had seen grand ladies. Then the city and the harbor of Yokohama, in 1,000 pictures, began flashing before his eyes. But he swiftly dismissed the kaleidoscope of memory, oppressed by the urgent need of the present. He knew that he must stand up to be introduced, and he struggled painfully to his feet, where he stood with trousers bagging at the knees, his arms loose-hanging and ludicrous, his face set hard for the impending ordeal. End of Chapter 1. Chapter 2 of Martin Eden by Jack London. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Chapter 2. The process of getting into the dining room was a nightmare to him. Between halts and stumbles, jerks and lurches, locomotion had at times seemed impossible. But at last he had made it, and was seated alongside of her. The array of knives and forks frightened him. They bristled with unknown perils, and he gazed at them, fascinated, till their dazzle became a background, across which moved a succession of forecastle pictures, wherein he and his mates sat eating salt beef with sheath knives and fingers, or scooping thick pea soup out of pannikins by means of battered iron spoons. The stench of bad beef was in his nostrils, while in his ears, to the accompaniment of creaking timbers and groaning bulkheads, echoed the loud mouth noises of the eaters. He watched them eating, and decided that they ate like pigs. Well, he would be careful here. He would make no noise. He would keep his mind upon it all the time. He glanced around the table. Opposite him was Arthur, and Arthur's brother, Norman. They were her brothers, he reminded himself, and his heart warmed toward them. How they loved each other, the members of this family! There flashed into his mind the picture of her mother, of the kiss of greeting, and of the pair of them walking toward him with arms entwined. Not in his world were such displays of affection between parents and children made. It was a revelation of the heights of existence that were attained in the world above. It was the finest thing yet he had seen in this small glimpse of that world. He was moved deeply by appreciation of it, and his heart was melting with sympathetic tenderness. He had starved for love all his life. His nature craved love. It was an organic demand of his being. Yet he had gone without it, and hardened himself in the process. He had not known that he needed love, nor did he know it now. He merely saw it in operation, and thrilled to it, and thought it fine and high and splendid. He was glad that Mr. Morse was not there. It was difficult enough getting acquainted with her, and her mother, and her brother, Norman. Arthur he already knew somewhat. The father would have been too much for him, he felt sure. It seemed to him that he had never worked so hard in his life. The severest toil was child's play compared with this. Tiny nodules of moisture stood out on his forehead, and his shirt was wet with sweat from the exertion of doing so many unaccustomed things at once. He had to eat as he had never eaten before, to handle strange tools, to glance surreptitiously about and learn how to accomplish each new thing, to receive the flood of impressions that was pouring in upon him and being mentally annotated and classified, to be conscious of a yearning for her that perturbed him in the form of a dull, aching restlessness, to feel the prod of desire to win the walk of life whereon she trod, and to have his mind ever and again straying off in speculation and vague plans of how to reach her. Also, when his secret glance went across to Norman opposite him, or to anyone else, to ascertain just what knife or fork was used in any particular occasion, that person's features were seized upon by his mind, which automatically strove to appraise them and to divine what they were, all in relation to her. Then he had to talk, to hear what was said to him, and what was said back and forth, and to answer, when it was necessary, with a tongue prone to looseness of speech that required a constant curb. And to add confusion to confusion, there was the servant, an unceasing menace, that appeared noiselessly at his shoulder, a dire sphinx that propounded puzzles and conundrums demanding instantaneous solution. He was oppressed throughout the meal by the thought of finger bowls. Irrelevantly, insistently, scores of times, he wondered when they would come on and what they looked like. He had heard of such things, and now, sooner or later, somewhere in the next few minutes, he would see them, sit at table with exalted beings who used them, aye, and he would use them himself. And most important of all, far down, and yet always at the surface of his thought, was the problem of how he should comport himself toward these persons. What should his attitude be? He wrestled continually and anxiously with the problem. There were cowardly suggestions that he should make believe, assume a part, and there were still more cowardly suggestions that warned him he would fail in such a course, that his nature was not fitted to live up to it, and that he would make a fool of himself. It was during the first part of the dinner, struggling to decide upon his attitude, that he was very quiet. He did not know that his quietness was giving the lie to Arthur's words of the day before, when the brother of hers had announced that he was going to bring a wild man home to dinner, and for them not to be alarmed, because they would find him an interesting wild man. Martin Eden could not have found it in him, just then, to believe that her brother could be guilty of such treachery, especially when he had been the means of getting this particular brother out of an unpleasant row. So he sat at table, perturbed by his own unfitness, and at the same time charmed by all that went on about him. For the first time he realized that eating was something more than a utilitarian function. He was unaware of what he ate. It was merely food. He was feasting his love of beauty at this table, where eating was an aesthetic function. It was an intellectual function, too. His mind was stirred. He heard words spoken that were meaningless to him, and other words that he had only seen in books and that no man or woman he had known was of large enough mental caliber to pronounce. When he heard such words dropping carelessly from the lips of the members of this marvelous family, her family, he thrilled with delight. The romance and beauty and high vigor of the books were coming true. He was in that rare and blissful state wherein a man sees dreams stalk out from the crannies of fantasy and become fact. Never had he been at such an altitude of living, and he kept himself in the background, listening, observing, and pleasuring, replying in reticent monosyllables, saying, "Yes, miss," and "No, miss," to her, and "Yes, ma'am," and "No, ma'am," to her mother. He curbed the impulse, arising out of his sea training, to say "Yes, sir," and "No, sir," to her brothers. He felt that it would be inappropriate and a confession of inferiority on his part, which would never do if he was to win her. Also, it was a dictate of his pride. "By God," he cried to himself once, "I'm just as good as them, and if they do know lots that I don't, I could learn 'em a few myself all the same." And the next moment, when she or her mother addressed him as Mr. Eden, his aggressive pride was forgotten, and he was glowing and warm with delight. He was a civilized man, that was what he was, shoulder to shoulder at dinner with people he had read about in books. He was in the books himself, adventuring through the printed pages of bound volumes. But while he belied Arthur's description, and appeared a gentle lamb rather than a wild man, he was racking his brains for a course of action. He was no gentle lamb, and the part of second fiddle would never do for the high-pitched dominance of his nature. He talked only when he had to, and then his speech was like his walk to the table, filled with jerks and halts as he groped in his polyglot vocabulary for words, debating over words he knew were fit, but which he feared he could not pronounce, rejecting other words he knew would not be understood or would be raw and harsh. But all the time he was oppressed by the consciousness that this carefulness of diction was making a booby of him, preventing him from expressing what he had in him. Also, his love of freedom chafed against the restriction in much the same way his neck chafed against the starched fetter of a collar. Besides, he was confident that he could not keep it up. He was by nature powerful of thought and sensibility, and the creative spirit was restive and urgent. He was swiftly mastered by the concept or sensation in him that struggled in birth throes to receive expression and form, and then he forgot himself and where he was, and the old words, the tools of speech he knew, slipped out. Once he declined something from the servant, who interrupted and pestered at his shoulder, and he said, shortly and emphatically, "Pew!" On the instant, those at the table were keyed up and expectant. The servant was smugly pleased, and he was wallowing in mortification, but he recovered himself quickly. "It's the Kanaka for finish," he explained, "and it just come out naturally. It's spelt P-A-U." He caught her curious and speculative eyes fixed on his hands, and being in an explanatory mood, he said, "I just come down the coast on one of the Pacific mail steamers. She was behind me, and around the Puget Sound ports we worked like niggers, storing cargo mixed freight, if you know what that means. That's how the skin got knocked off." "Oh, it wasn't that," she hastened to explain in turn. "Your hands seem too small for your body." His cheeks were hot. He took it as an exposure of another of his deficiencies. "Yes," he said depreciatingly, "they ain't big enough to stand the strain. I can hit like a mule with my arms and shoulders. They are too strong, and when I smash a man on the jaw, the hands get smashed too." He was not happy at what he had said. He was filled with disgust at himself. He had loosed the guard upon his tongue and talked about things that were not nice. "It was brave of you to help Arthur the way you did, and you a stranger," she said tactfully, aware of his discomfiture, though not of the reason for it. He, in turn, realized what she had done, and in the consequent warm surge of gratefulness that overwhelmed him, forgot his loose-worded tongue. "It wasn't nothin' at all," he said. "Any guy'd do it for another. That bunch of hoodlums was lookin' for trouble, and Arthur wasn't botherin' 'em none. They butted in on him, and then I butted in on them and poked a few. That's where some of the skin off my hands went, along with some of the teeth of the gang. I wouldn't have missed it for anything, when I seen—" He paused, open-mouthed, on the verge of the pit of his own depravity and utter worthlessness to breathe the same air she did, and while Arthur took up the tale, for the 20th time, of his adventure with the drunken hoodlums on the ferry-boat, and of how Martin Eden had rushed in and rescued him, that individual, with frowning brows, meditated upon the fool he had made of himself, and wrestled more determinedly with the problem of how he should conduct himself toward these people. He certainly had not succeeded so far. He wasn't of their tribe, and he couldn't talk their lingo, was the way he put it to himself. He couldn't fake being their kind. The masquerade would fail, and besides, masquerade was foreign to his nature. There was no room in him for sham or artifice. Whatever happened, he must be real. He couldn't talk their talk just yet, though in time he would. Upon that he was resolved. But in the meantime, talk he must. And it must be his own talk, toned down, of course, so as to be comprehensible to them, and so as not to shook them too much. And furthermore, he wouldn't claim, not even by tacit acceptance, to be familiar with anything that was unfamiliar. In pursuance of this decision, when the two brothers, talking university shop, had used trig several times, Martin Eden demanded, "What is trig?" "Trigonometry," Norman said, "a higher form of math." "And what is math?" was the next question, which somehow brought the laugh on Norman. "Mathematics, arithmetic," was the answer. Martin Eden nodded. He had caught a glimpse of the apparently illimitable vistas of knowledge. What he saw took on tangibility. His abnormal power of vision made his abstractions take on concrete form. In the alchemy of his brain, trigonometry and mathematics and the whole field of knowledge which they betokened were transmuted into so much landscape. The vistas he saw were vistas of green foliage and forest glades, all softly luminous or shot through with flashing lights. In the distance, detail was veiled and blurred by a purple haze, but beyond the purple haze, he knew, was the glamour of the unknown, the lure of romance. It was like wine to him. Here was adventure, something to do with head and hand, a world to conquer. And straightway from the back of his consciousness rushed the thought, conquering to win her, that lily-pale spirit sitting beside him. The glimmering vision was rent asunder and dissipated by Arthur, who, all evening, had been trying to draw his wild man out. Martin Eden remembered his decision. For the first time he became himself. Consciously and deliberately at first, but soon lost in the joy of creating and making life as he knew it appear before his listeners' eyes. He had been a member of the crew of the smuggling schooner Halcyon when she was captured by a revenue cutter. He saw with wide eyes, and he could tell what he saw. He brought the pulsing sea before them, and the men and the ships upon the sea. He communicated his power of vision, till they saw with his eyes what he had seen. He selected from the vast mass of detail with an artist's touch, drawing pictures of life that glowed and burned with light and color, injecting movement so that his listeners surged along with him on the flood of rough eloquence, enthusiasm, and power. At times he shocked them with the vividness of the narrative and his terms of speech, but beauty always followed fast upon the heels of violence, and tragedy was relieved by humor, by interpretations of the strange twists and quirks of sailors' minds. And while he talked, the girl looked at him with startled eyes. His fire warmed her. She wondered if she had been cold all her days. She wanted to lean toward this burning, blazing man that was like a volcano, spouting forth strength, robustness, and health. She felt that she must lean toward him, and resisted by an effort. Then, too, there was the counter-impulse to shrink away from him. She was repelled by those lacerated hands, grimed by toil, so that the very dirt of life was ingrained in the flesh itself, by the red chafe of the collar and those bulging muscles. His roughness frightened her. Each roughness of speech was an insult to her ear, each rough phase of his life an insult to her soul. And ever and again would come the draw of him, till she thought he must be evil to have such power over her. All that was most firmly established in her mind was rocking. His romance and adventure were battering at the conventions. Before his facile perils and ready laugh, life was no longer an affair of serious effort and restraint, but a toy, to be played with and turned topsy-turvy, carelessly to be lived and pleasured in, and carelessly to be flung aside. Therefore, play was the cry that rang through her. Lean toward him, if you will, and place your 2 hands upon his neck. She wanted to cry out at the recklessness of the thought, and in vain she appraised her own cleanness and culture, and balanced all that she was against what he was not. She glanced about her and saw the others gazing at him with rapt attention, and she would have despaired had not she seen horror in her mother's eyes. Fascinated horror, it was true, but none the less horror. This man from outer darkness was evil. Her mother saw it, and her mother was right. She would trust her mother's judgment in this, as she had always trusted it in all things. The fire of him was no longer warm, and the fear of him was no longer poignant. Later, at the piano, she played for him and at him aggressively, with the vague intent of emphasizing the impassableness of the gulf that separated them. Her music was a club that she swung brutally upon his head, and though it stunned him and crushed him down, it incited him. He gazed upon her in awe. In his mind, as in her own, the gulf widened, but faster than it widened, towered his ambition to win across it. But he was too complicated a plexus of sensibilities to sit staring at a gulf a whole evening, especially when there was music. He was remarkably susceptible to music. It was like strong drink, firing him to audacities of feeling, a drug that laid hold of his imagination and went cloud-soaring through the sky. It banished sordid fact, flooded his mind with beauty, loosed romance, and to its heels added wings. He did not understand the music she played. It was different from the dance-hall piano-banging and blatant brass bands he had heard. But he had caught hints of such music from the books, and he accepted her playing largely on faith, patiently waiting at first for the lilting measures of pronounced and simple rhythm, puzzled because those measures were not long continued. Just as he caught the swing of them and started, his imagination attuned in flight, always they vanished away in a chaotic scramble of sounds that was meaningless to him, and that dropped his imagination, an inert weight, back to earth. Once it entered his mind that there was a deliberate rebuff in all this. He caught her spirit of antagonism and strove to divine the message that her hands pronounced upon the keys. Then he dismissed the thought as unworthy and impossible, and yielded himself more freely to the music. The old delightful condition began to be induced. His feet were no longer clay, and his flesh became spirit. Before his eyes and behind his eyes shone a great glory, and then the scene before him vanished and he was away, rocking over the world that was to him a very dear world. The known and the unknown were commingled in the dream pageant that thronged his vision. He entered strange ports of sun-washed lands, and trod marketplaces among barbaric peoples that no man had ever seen. The scent of the Spice Islands was in his nostrils as he had known it on warm, breathless nights at sea, or he beat up against the southeast trades through long tropic days, sinking palm-tufted coral islets in the turquoise sea behind, and lifting palm-tufted coral islets in the turquoise sea ahead. Swift as thought, the pictures came and went. One instant he was astride a bronco, and flying through the fairy-colored, painted desert country. The next instant he was gazing down through shimmering heat into the whited sepulchre of Death Valley, or pulling an oar on a freezing ocean where great ice islands towered and glistened in the sun. He lay on a coral beach where the coconuts grew down to the mellow-sounding surf. The hulk of an ancient wreck burned with blue fires, in the light of which danced the hula dancers to the barbaric love calls of the singers, who chanted to tinkling ukuleles and rumbling tom-toms. It was a sensuous tropic night. In the background a volcano crater was silhouetted against the stars. Overhead drifted a pale crescent moon, and the Southern Cross burned low in the sky. He was a harp. All life that he had known, and that was his consciousness, was the strings. And the flood of music was a wind that poured against those strings, and set them vibrating with memories and dreams. He did not merely feel. Sensation invested itself in form and color and radiance, and what his imagination dared, it objectified in some sublimated and magic way. Past, present, and future mingled, and he went on oscillating across the broad, warm world, through high adventure and noble deeds, to her, aye, and with her, winning her, his arm about her, and carrying her on in flight through the empery of his mind. And she, glancing at him across her shoulder, saw something of all this in his face. It was a transfigured face, with great shining eyes, that gazed beyond the veil of sound, and saw behind it the leap and pulse of life, and the gigantic phantoms of the spirit. She was startled. The raw, stumbling lout was gone. The ill-fitting clothes, battered hands, and sunburned face remained, but these seemed the prison bars, through which she saw a great soul looking forth, inarticulate and dumb because of those feeble lips that would not give it speech. Only for a flashing moment did she see this. Then she saw the lout returned, and she laughed at the whim of her fancy. But the impression of that fleeting glimpse lingered, and when the time came for him to beat a stumbling retreat and go, she lent him a volume of Swinburne and another of Browning. She was studying Browning in one of her English courses. He seemed such a boy, as he stood blushing and stammering his thanks, that a wave of pity, maternal in its prompting, welled up in her. She did not remember the lout, nor the imprisoned soul, nor the man who had stared at her in all masculineness and delighted and frightened her. She saw before her only a boy, who was shaking her hand with a hand so calloused that it felt like a nutmeg grater and rasped her skin, and who was saying jerkily, "The greatest time of my life. You see, I ain't used to things." He looked about him helplessly. "To people and houses like this. It's all new to me, and I like it." "I hope you'll call again," she said, as he was saying good night to her brothers. He pulled on his cap, lurched desperately through the doorway, and was gone. "Well, what do you think of him?" Arthur demanded. "He is most interesting. A whiff of ozone," she answered. "How old is he?" 20, almost 21. I asked him this afternoon. I didn't think he was that young." "And I am 3 years older," was the thought in her mind as she kissed her brothers good night. End of chapter 2. Chapter 3 of Martin Eden by Jack London. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Chapter 3. As Martin Eden went down the steps, his hand dropped into his coat pocket. It came out with a brown rice paper and a pinch of Mexican tobacco, which were deftly rolled together into a cigarette. He drew the first whiff of smoke deep into his lungs and expelled it in a long and lingering exhalation. "By God," he said aloud, in a voice of awe and wonder. "By God," he repeated. And yet again he murmured, "By God." Then his hand went to his collar, which he ripped out of the shirt and stuffed into his pocket. A cold drizzle was falling, but he bared his head to it and unbuttoned his vest, swinging along in splendid unconcern. He was only dimly aware that it was raining. He was in an ecstasy, dreaming dreams and reconstructing the scenes just past. He had met the woman at last, the woman that he had thought little about, not being given to thinking about women, but whom he had expected, in a remote way, he would sometime meet. He had sat next to her at table. He had felt her hand in his. He had looked into her eyes and caught a vision of a beautiful spirit, but no more beautiful than the eyes through which it shone, nor than the flesh that gave it expression and form. He did not think of her flesh as flesh, which was new to him. For of the women he had known, that was the only way he thought. Her flesh was somehow different. He did not conceive of her body as a body, subject to the ills and frailties of bodies. Her body was more than the garb of her spirit. It was an emanation of her spirit, a pure and gracious crystallization of her divine essence. This feeling of the divine startled him. It shocked him from his dreams to sober thought. No word, no clue, no hint of the divine had ever reached him before. He had never believed in the divine. He had always been irreligious, scoffing good-naturedly at the sky pilots and their immortality of the soul. There was no life beyond, he had contended. It was here and now, then darkness everlasting. But what he had seen in her eyes was soul, immortal soul that could never die. No man he had ever known, nor any woman, had given him the message of immortality, but she had. She had whispered it to him the first moment she looked at him. Her face shimmered before his eyes as he walked along, pale and serious, sweet and sensitive, smiling with pity and tenderness as only a spirit could smile, and pure as he had never dreamed purity could be. Her purity smote him like a blow. It startled him. He had known good and bad, but purity, as an attribute of existence, had never entered his mind. And now, in her, he conceived purity to be the superlative of goodness and of cleanness, the sum of which constituted eternal life, and promptly urged his ambition to grasp at eternal life. He was not fit to carry water for her, he knew that. It was a miracle of luck and a fantastic stroke that had enabled him to see her and be with her and talk with her that night. It was accidental. There was no merit in it. He did not deserve such fortune. His mood was essentially religious. He was humble and meek, filled with self-disparagement and abasement. In such frame of mind, sinners come to the penitent form. He was convicted of sin. But as the meek and lowly at the penitent form catch splendid glimpses of their future lordly existence, so did he catch similar glimpses of the state he would gain to by possessing her. But this possession of her was dim and nebulous, and totally different from possession as he had known it. Ambition soared on mad wings, and he saw himself climbing the heights with her, sharing thoughts with her, pleasuring in beautiful and noble things with her. It was a soul possession he dreamed, refined beyond any grossness, a free comradeship of spirit that he could not put into definite thought. He did not think it. For that matter, he did not think at all. Sensation usurped reason, and he was quivering and palpitant with emotions he had never known, drifting deliciously on a sea of sensibility, where feeling itself was exalted and spiritualized, and carried beyond the summits of life. He staggered along like a drunken man, murmuring fervently aloud, "By God! By God!" A policeman on a street corner eyed him suspiciously, then noted his sailor roll. "Where did you get it?" the policeman demanded. Martin Eden came back to earth. He was a fluid organism, swiftly adjustable, capable of flowing into and filling all sorts of nooks and crannies. With the policeman's hail, he was immediately his ordinary self, grasping the situation clearly. "It's a beaut, ain't it?" he laughed back. "I didn't know I was talking out loud." "You'll be singing next," was the policeman's diagnosis. "No, I won't. Give me a match and I'll catch the next car home." He lighted his cigarette and said good night and went on. "Now wouldn't that rattle you?" he ejaculated under his breath. "That copper thought I was a drunk." He smiled to himself and meditated. "I guess I was," he added, "but I didn't think a woman's face'd do it." He caught a Telegraph Avenue car that was going to Berkeley. It was crowded with youths and young men who were singing songs and ever and again barking out college yells. He studied them curiously. They were university boys. They went to the same university that she did, were in her class socially, could know her, could see her every day if they wanted to. He wondered that they did not want to, that they had been out having a good time instead of being with her that evening, talking with her, sitting around in a worshipful and adoring circle. His thoughts wandered on. He noticed one with narrow-slitted eyes and a loose-lipped mouth. That fellow was vicious, he decided. On shipboard he would be a sneak, a whiner, a tattler. He, Martin Eden, was a better man than that fellow. The thought cheered him. It seemed to draw him nearer to her. He began comparing himself with the students. He grew conscious of the muscled mechanism of his body, and felt confident that he was physically their master. But their heads were filled with knowledge that enabled them to talk her talk. The thought depressed him. But what was a brain for? He demanded passionately. What they had done, he could do. They had been studying about life from the books, while he had been busy living life. His brain was just as full of knowledge as theirs, though it was a different kind of knowledge. How many of them could tie a lanyard knot, or take a wheel or a lookout? His life spread out before him in a series of pictures of danger and daring, hardship and toil. He remembered his failures and scrapes in the process of learning. He was that much to the good, anyway. Later on, they would have to begin living life, and going through the mill as he had gone. Very well. While they were busy with that, he would be learning the other side of life from the books. As the car crossed the zone of scattered dwellings that separated Oakland from Berkeley, he kept a lookout for a familiar two-story building along the front of which ran the proud sign, Higginbotham's Cash Store. Martin Eden got off at this corner. He stared up for a moment at the sign. It carried a message to him beyond its mere wording. A personality of smallness and egotism and petty underhandedness seemed to emanate from the letters themselves. Bernard Higginbotham had married his sister, and he knew him well. He let himself in with a latchkey and climbed the stairs to the second floor. Here lived his brother-in-law. The grocery was below. There was a smell of stale vegetables in the air. As he groped his way across the hall, he stumbled over a toy cart, left there by one of his numerous nephews and nieces, and brought up against a door with a resounding bang. The pincher, was his thought, too miserly to burn 2 cents worth of gas and save his boarders' necks. He fumbled for the knob and entered a lighted room where sat his sister and Bernard Higginbotham. She was patching a pair of his trousers, while his lean body was distributed over 2 chairs, his feet dangling in dilapidated carpet slippers over the edge of the second chair. He glanced across the top of the paper he was reading, showing a pair of dark, insincere, sharp-staring eyes. Martin Eden never looked at him without experiencing a sense of repulsion. What his sister had seen in the man was beyond him. The other affected him as so much vermin, and always aroused in him an impulse to crush him under his foot. "Some day I'll beat the face off of him," was the way he often consoled himself for enduring the man's existence. The eyes, weasel-like and cruel, were looking at him complainingly. "Well," Martin demanded, "out with it." "I had that door painted only last week," Mr. Higginbotham half whined, half bullied. "And you know what union wages are. You should be more careful." Martin had intended to reply, but he was struck by the hopelessness of it. He gazed across the monstrous sordidness of soul to a chromo on the wall. It surprised him. He had always liked it, but it seemed that now he was seeing it for the first time. It was cheap, that was what it was, like everything else in this house. His mind went back to the house he had just left, and he saw, first, the paintings, and next, her, looking at him with melting sweetness as she shook his hand at leaving. He forgot where he was, and Bernard Higginbotham's existence, till that gentleman demanded, "Seen a ghost?" Martin came back and looked at the beady eyes, sneering, truculent, cowardly, and there leaped into his vision, as on a screen, the same eyes when their owner was making a sale in the store below, subservient eyes, smug and oily and flattering. "Yes," Martin answered, "I seen a ghost. Good night, Gertrude." He started to leave the room, tripping over a loose seam in the slatternly carpet. "Don't bang the door," Mr. Higginbotham cautioned him. He felt the blood crawl in his veins, but controlled himself and closed the door softly behind him. Mr. Higginbotham looked at his wife exultantly. "He's been drinkin'," he proclaimed in a hoarse whisper. "I told you he would." She nodded her head resignedly. "His eyes was pretty shiny," she confessed, "and he didn't have no collar, though he went away with one, but maybe he didn't have more'n a couple of glasses." "He couldn't stand up straight," asserted her husband. "I watched him. He couldn't walk across the floor without stumbling. You heard him yourself almost fall down in the hall." "I think it was over Alice's cart," she said. "He couldn't see in the dark." Mr. Higginbotham's voice and wrath began to rise. All day he effaced himself in the store, reserving for the evening with his family the privilege of being himself. "I tell you, that brother of yours was drunk." His voice was cold, sharp, and final, his lips stamping the enunciation of each word like the die of a machine. His wife sighed and remained silent. She was a large, stout woman, always dressed slatternly, and always tired from the burdens of her flesh, her work, and her husband. "He's got it in him, I tell you, from his father," Mr. Higginbotham went on accusingly. "And he'll croak in the gutter the same way, you know that." She nodded, sighed, and went on stitching. They were agreed that Martin had come home drunk. They did not have it in their souls to know beauty, or they would have known that those shining eyes and that glowing face betokened youth's first vision of love. "Settin' a fine example to the children," Mr. Higginbotham snorted, suddenly, in the silence for which his wife was responsible, and which he resented. Sometimes he almost wished she would oppose him more. "If he does it again, he's got to get out, understand? I won't put up with his shenanigan, debauchin' innocent children with his boozing." Mr. Higginbotham liked the word, which was a new one in his vocabulary, recently gleaned from a newspaper column. "That's what it is, debauchin'. There ain't no other name for it." Still his wife sighed, shook her head sorrowfully, and stitched on. Mr. Higginbotham resumed the newspaper. "Has he paid last week's board?" He shot across the top of the newspaper. She nodded, then added, "He still has some money." "When is he going to sea again?" "When his payday's spent, I guess," she answered. "He was over to San Francisco yesterday looking for a ship, but he's got money yet, and he's particular about the kind of ship he signs for." "It's not for a deck swab like him to put on airs," Mr. Higginbotham snorted. "Particular. Him. He said something about a schooner that's getting ready to go off to some outlandish place to look for buried treasure, that he'd sail on her if his money held out. If he only wanted to steady down, I'd give him a job driving the wagon," her husband said, but with no trace of benevolence in his voice. "Tom's quit." His wife looked alarm and interrogation. "Quit tonight. Is going to work for Carruthers. They paid him more than I could afford." "I told you you'd lose him," she cried out. "He was worth more than you was giving him." "Now look here, old woman," Higginbotham bullied. For the 1000th time I've told you to keep your nose out of the business. I won't tell you again." "I don't care," she sniffled. "Tom was a good boy." Her husband glared at her. This was unqualified defiance. "If that brother of yours was worth his salt, he could take the wagon," he snorted. "He pays his board just the same," was the retort. "And he's my brother, and so long as he don't owe you money, you've got no right to be jumping on him all the time. I've got some feelings, if I have been married to you for 7 years." "Did you tell him you'd charge him for gas if he goes on readin' in bed?" he demanded. Mrs. Higginbotham made no reply. Her revolt faded away, her spirit wilting down into her tired flesh. Her husband was triumphant. He had her. His eyes snapped vindictively, while his ears joyed in the sniffle she emitted. He extracted great happiness from squelching her, and she squelched easily these days, though it had been different in the first year of their married life, before the brood of children and his incessant nagging had sapped her energy. "Well, you tell him tomorrow, that's all," he said. "And I just want to tell you, before I forget it, that you'd better send for Marian tomorrow to take care of the children. With Tom quit, I'll have to be out on the wagon, and you can make up your mind to it to be down below waiting on the counter." "But tomorrow's wash day," she objected weakly. "Get up early then and do it first. I won't start out till 10 o'clock. He crinkled the paper viciously and resumed his reading. End of chapter 3. Chapter 4 of Martin Eden by Jack London. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Chapter 4. Martin Eden, with blood still crawling from contact with his brother-in-law, felt his way along the unlighted back hall and entered his room, a tiny cubbyhole with space for a bed, a washstand, and one chair. Mr. Higginbotham was too thrifty to keep a servant when his wife could do the work. Besides, the servants' room enabled them to take in 2 boarders instead of 1. Martin placed the Swinburne and the Browning on the chair, took off his coat, and sat down on the bed. A screeching of asthmatic springs greeted the weight of his body, but he did not notice them. He started to take off his shoes, but fell to staring at the white plaster wall opposite him, broken by long streaks of dirty brown where rain had leaked through the roof. On this befouled background, visions began to flow and burn. He forgot his shoes and stared long, till his lips began to move, and he murmured, "Ruth, Ruth." He had not thought a simple sound could be so beautiful. It delighted his ear, and he grew intoxicated with the repetition of it. Ruth. It was a talisman, a magic word to conjure with. Each time he murmured it, her face shimmered before him, suffusing the foul wall with a golden radiance. This radiance did not stop at the wall. It extended on into infinity, and through its golden depths his soul went questing after hers. The best that was in him was out in splendid flood. The very thought of her ennobled and purified him, made him better, and made him want to be better. This was new to him. He had never known women who had made him feel better. They had always had the counter-effect of making him feel beastly. He did not know that many of them had done their best, bad as it was. Never having been conscious of himself, he did not know that he had that in his being that drew love from women, and which had been the cause of their reaching out for his youth. Though they had often bothered him, he had never bothered about them, and he would never have dreamed that there were women who would have been better because of him. Always in sublime carelessness had he lived, till now, and now it seemed to him that they had always reached out and dragged at him with vile hands. This was not just to them, nor to himself, but he, who for the first time was becoming conscious of himself, was in no condition to judge, and he burned with shame as he stared at the vision of his infamy. He got up abruptly and tried to see himself in the dirty looking-glass over the washstand. He passed a towel over it and looked again, long and carefully. It was the first time he had ever really seen himself. His eyes were made for seeing, but up to that moment they had been filled with the ever-changing panorama of the world, at which he had been too busy gazing ever to gaze at himself. He saw the head and face of a young fellow of 20, but, being unused to such appraisement, he did not know how to value it. Above a square-domed forehead he saw a mop of brown hair, nut-brown, with a wave to it and hints of curl that were a delight to any woman, making hands tingle to stroke it, and fingers tingle to pass caresses through it. But he passed it by as without merit, in her eyes, and dwelt long and thoughtfully on the high square forehead, striving to penetrate it and learn the quality of its content. What kind of a brain lay behind there? Was his insistent interrogation. What was it capable of? How far would it take him? Would it take him to her? He wondered if there were soul in those steel-gray eyes, that were often quite blue of color, and that were strong with the briny airs of the sun-washed deep. He wondered, too, how his eyes looked to her. He tried to imagine himself she, gazing into those eyes of his, but failed in the jugglery. He could successfully put himself inside other men's minds, but they had to be men whose ways of life he knew. He did not know her way of life. She was wonder and mystery, and how could he guess one thought of hers? Well, they were honest eyes, he concluded, and in them was neither smallness nor meanness. The brown sunburn of his face surprised him. He had not dreamed he was so black. He rolled up his shirt-sleeve and compared the white underside of the arm with his face. Yes, he was a white man after all, but the arms were sunburned too. He twisted his arm, rolled his biceps over with his other hand, and gazed underneath, where he was least touched by the sun. It was very white. He laughed at his bronzed face in the glass, at the thought that it was once as white as the underside of his arm. Nor did he dream that in the world there were few pale spirits of women who could boast of fairer or smoother skins than he, fairer than where he had escaped the ravages of the sun. His might have been a cherub's mouth, had not the full, sensuous lips a trick, under stress, of drawing firmly across the teeth. At times, so tightly did they draw, the mouth became stern and harsh, very ascetic. They were the lips of a fighter and of a lover. They could taste the sweetness of life with relish, and they could put the sweetness aside and command life. The chin and jaw, strong and just hinting of square aggressiveness, helped the lips to command life. Strength balanced sensuousness and had upon it a tonic effect, compelling him to love beauty that was healthy, and making him vibrate to sensations that were wholesome. And between the lips were teeth that had never known nor needed the dentist's care. They were white and strong and regular, he decided, as he looked at them. But as he looked, he began to be troubled. Somewhere, stored away in the recesses of his mind and vaguely remembered, was the impression that there were people who washed their teeth every day. They were people from up above, people in her class. She must wash her teeth every day, too. What would she think if she learned that he had never washed his teeth in all the days of his life? He resolved to get a toothbrush and form the habit. He would begin at once, tomorrow. It was not by mere achievement that he could hope to win her. He must make a personal reform in all things, even to tooth-washing and neck-gear, though a starched collar affected him as a renunciation of freedom. He held up his hand, rubbing the ball of the thumb over the calloused palm, and gazing at the dirt that was ingrained in the flesh itself, and which no brush could scrub away. How different was her palm! He thrilled deliciously at the remembrance. Like a rose petal, he thought, cool and soft as a snowflake. He had never thought that a mere woman's hand could be so sweetly soft. He caught himself imagining the wonder of a caress from such a hand, and flushed guiltily. It was too gross a thought for her. In ways it seemed to impugn her high spirituality. She was a pale, slender spirit, exalted far beyond the flesh. But nevertheless the softness of her palm persisted in his thoughts. He was used to the harsh callousness of factory girls and working women. Well he knew why their hands were rough, but this hand of hers, it was soft because she had never used it to work with. The gulf yawned between her and him, at the awesome thought of a person who did not have to work for a living. He suddenly saw the aristocracy of the people who did not labor. It towered before him on the wall, a figure in brass, arrogant and powerful. He had worked himself. His first memories seemed connected with work, and all his family had worked. There was Gertrude. When her hands were not hard from the endless housework, they were swollen and red, like boiled beef, what of the washing. And there was his sister Marion. She had worked in the cannery the preceding summer, and her slim, pretty hands were all scarred with the tomato knives. Besides, the tips of two of her fingers had been left in the cutting machine at the paper box factory the preceding winter. He remembered the hard palms of his mother as she lay in her coffin. And his father had worked to the last fading gasp. The horned growth of his hands must have been half an inch thick when he died. But her hands were soft, and her mother's hands, and her brother's. This last came to him as a surprise. It was tremendously indicative of the highness of their caste, of the enormous distance that stretched between her and him. He sat back on the bed with a bitter laugh, and finished taking off his shoes. He was a fool. He had been made drunken by a woman's face and by a woman's soft white hands. And then, suddenly, before his eyes, on the foul plaster wall, appeared a vision. He stood in front of a gloomy tenement house. It was night-time, in the East End of London, and before him stood Margie, a little factory girl of 15. He had seen her home after the bean feast. She lived in that gloomy tenement, a place not fit for swine. His hand was going out to hers as he said good night. She had put her lips up to be kissed, but he wasn't going to kiss her. Somehow he was afraid of her. And then her hand closed on his and pressed feverishly. He felt her calluses grind and grate on his, and a great wave of pity welled over him. He saw her yearning, hungry eyes, and her ill-fed female form, which had been rushed from childhood into a frightened and ferocious maturity. Then he put his arms about her in large tolerance, and stooped and kissed her on the lips. Her glad little cry rang in his ears, and he felt her clinging to him like a cat. Poor little starveling! He continued to stare at the vision of what had happened in the long ago. His flesh was crawling as it had crawled that night when she clung to him, and his heart was warm with pity. It was a gray scene, greasy gray, and the rain drizzled greasily on the pavement stones. And then a radiant glory shone on the wall, and up through the other vision, displacing it, glimmered her pale face under its crown of golden hair, remote and inaccessible as a star. He took the Browning and the Swinburne from the chair and kissed them. Just the same, she told me to call again, he thought. He took another look at himself in the glass and said aloud with great solemnity, "Martin Eden, the first thing tomorrow you go to the Free Library and read up on etiquette. Understand?" He turned off the gas, and the spring shrieked under his body. "But you've got to quit cussin', Martin, old boy. You've got to quit cussin'," he said aloud. Then he dozed off to sleep and to dream dreams that for madness and audacity rivaled those of poppy-eaters. End of chapter 4. Chapter 5 of Martin Eden by Jack London. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Chapter 5. He awoke next morning from rosy scenes of dream to a steamy atmosphere that smelled of soapsuds and dirty clothes, and that was vibrant with the jar and jangle of tormented life. As he came out of his room, he heard the slosh of water, a sharp exclamation, and a resounding smack as his sister visited her irritation upon one of her numerous progeny. The squall of the child went through him like a knife. He was aware that the whole thing, the very air he breathed, was repulsive and mean. How different, he thought, from the atmosphere of beauty and repose of the house wherein Ruth dwelt. There it was all spiritual. Here it was all material, and meanly material. "Come here, Alfred," he called to the crying child, at the same time thrusting his hand into his trousers pocket, where he carried his money loose in the same large way that he lived life in general. He put a quarter in the youngster's hand, and held him in his arms a moment, soothing his sobs. "Now run along and get some candy, and don't forget to give some to your brothers and sisters. Be sure and get the kind that lasts longest." His sister lifted a flushed face from the wash-tub and looked at him. "A nickel'd have been enough," she said. "It's just like you, no idea of the value of money. The child'll eat himself sick." "That's all right, sis," he answered jovially. "My money'll take care of itself. If you weren't so busy, I'd kiss you good morning." He wanted to be affectionate to his sister, who was good, and who, in her way, he knew, loved him. But somehow she grew less herself as the years went by, and more baffling. It was the hard work, the many children, and the nagging of her husband, he decided, that had changed her. It came to him in a flash of fancy that her nature seemed taking on the attributes of stale vegetables, smelly soap-suds, and of the greasy dimes, nickels, and quarters she took in over the counter of the store. "Go along and get your breakfast," she said roughly, though secretly pleased. Of all her wandering brood of brothers, he had always been her favorite. "I declare I will kiss you," she said, with a sudden stir at her heart. With thumb and forefinger she swept the dripping suds first from one arm and then from the other. He put his arms round her massive waist and kissed her wet, steamy lips. The tears welled into her eyes, not so much from strength of feeling as from the weakness of chronic overwork. She shoved him away from her, but not before he caught a glimpse of her moist eyes. "You'll find breakfast in the oven," she said hurriedly. "Jim ought to be up now. I had to get up early for the washing. Now get along with you and get out of the house early. It won't be nice today, what of Jim quittin' and nobody but Bernard to drive the wagon." Martin went into the kitchen with a sinking heart, the image of her red face and slatternly form eating its way like acid into his brain. She might love him if she only had some time, he concluded, but she was worked to death. Bernard Higginbotham was a brute to work her so hard. But he could not help but feel, on the other hand, that there had not been anything beautiful in that kiss. It was true, it was an unusual kiss. For years she had kissed him only when he returned from voyages or departed on voyages. But this kiss had tasted soap-suds, and the lips, he had noticed, were flabby. There had been no quick, vigorous lip pressure, such as should accompany any kiss. Hers was the kiss of a tired woman who had been tired so long that she had forgotten how to kiss. He remembered her as a girl, before her marriage, when she would dance with the best all night, after a hard day's work at the laundry, and think nothing of leaving the dance to go to another day's hard work. And then he thought of Ruth, and the cool sweetness that must reside in her lips, as it resided in all about her. Her kiss would be like her handshake, or the way she looked at one, firm and frank. In imagination he dared to think of her lips on his, and so vividly did he imagine that, he went dizzy at the thought, and seemed to rift through clouds of rose petals, filling his brain with their perfume. In the kitchen he found Jim, the other boarder, eating mush very languidly, with a sick, far-away look in his eyes. Jim was a plumber's apprentice, whose weak chin and hedonistic temperament, coupled with a certain nervous stupidity, promised to take him nowhere in the race for bread and butter. "Why don't you eat?" he demanded, as Martin dipped dolefully into the dark, half-cooked oatmeal mush. "Was you drunk again last night?" Martin shook his head. He was oppressed by the utter squalidness of it all. Ruth Morse seemed farther removed than ever. "I was," Jim went on with a boastful, nervous giggle. "I was loaded right to the neck. Oh, and she was a daisy. Billy brought me home." Martin nodded that he heard. It was a habit of nature with him to pay heed to whoever talked to him, and poured a cup of lukewarm coffee. "Going to the Lotus Club dance tonight?" Jim demanded. "They're going to have beer, and if that Temescal bunch comes, there'll be a roughhouse. I don't care, though. I'm taking my lady friend just the same. Cripes, but I've got a taste in my mouth." He made a wry face and attempted to wash the taste away with coffee. "Do you know Julia?" Martin shook his head. "She's my lady friend," Jim explained, "and she's a peach. I'd introduce you to her, only you'd win her. I don't see what the girls see in you. Honest, I don't. But the way you win them away from the fellers is sickening." "I never got any away from you," Martin answered uninterestedly. "The breakfast had to be got through somehow." "Yes, you did, too," the other asserted warmly. "There was Maggie." "Never had anything to do with her. Never danced with her except that one night." "Yes, and that's just what did it," Jim cried out. "You just danced with her and looked at her, and it was all off. Of course you didn't mean nothing by it, but it settled me for keeps. Wouldn't look at me again, always asking about you. She'd have made fast dates enough with you if you'd wanted to. But I didn't want to. Wasn't necessary. I was left at the pole." Jim looked at him admiringly. "How do you do it anyway, Mart?" "By not caring about him," was the answer. "You mean making believe you don't care about him?" Jim queried eagerly. Martin considered for a moment, then answered. "Perhaps that will do, but with me I guess it's different. I never have cared much. If you can put it on, it's all right, most likely." "You should have been up at Riley's barn last night," Jim announced inconsequently. "A lot of the fellers put on the gloves. There was a peach from West Oakland. They called him the Rat, slick as silk. No one could touch him. We was all wishing you was there. Where was you, anyway?" "Down in Oakland," Martin replied. "To the show?" Martin shoved his plate away and got up. "Coming to the dance tonight?" the other called after him. "No, I think not," he answered. He went downstairs and out into the street, breathing great breaths of air. He had been suffocating in that atmosphere, while the apprentice's chatter had driven him frantic. There had been times when it was all he could do to refrain from reaching over and mopping Jim's face in the mush plate. The more he had chattered, the more remote had Ruth seemed to him. How could he, herding with such cattle, ever become worthy of her? He was appalled at the problem confronting him, weighted down by the incubus of his working-class station. Everything reached out to hold him down. His sister, his sister's house and family, Jim the apprentice, everybody he knew, every tie of life. Existence did not taste good in his mouth. Up to then he had accepted existence, as he had lived with it all about him, as a good thing. He had never questioned it, except when he read books. But then, they were only books, fairy stories of a fairer and impossible world. But now he had seen that world, possible and real, with a flower of a woman called Ruth in the midmost center of it, and thenceforth he must know bitter tastes, and longing sharp as pain, and hopelessness that tantalized because it fed on hope. He had debated between the Berkeley Free Library and the Oakland Free Library, and decided upon the latter because Ruth lived in Oakland. Who could tell? A library was a most likely place for her, and he might see her there. He did not know the way of libraries, and he wandered through endless rows of fiction, till the delicate-featured, French-looking girl who seemed in charge told him that the reference department was upstairs. He did not know enough to ask the man at the desk, and began his adventures in the philosophy alcove. He had heard of book philosophy, but had not imagined there had been so much written about it. The high, bulging shelves of heavy tomes humbled him, and at the same time stimulated him. Here was work for the vigor of his brain. He found books on trigonometry in the mathematics section, and ran the pages, and stared at the meaningless formulas and figures. He could read English, but he saw there an alien speech. Norman and Arthur knew that speech. He had heard them talking it, and they were her brothers. He left the alcove in despair. From every side the book seemed to press upon him and crush him. He had never dreamed that the fund of human knowledge bulked so big. He was frightened. How could his brain ever master it all? Later, he remembered that there were other men, many men, who had mastered it, and he breathed a great oath, passionately, under his breath, swearing that his brain could do what theirs had done. And so he walked on, alternating between depression and elation, as he stared at the shelves packed with wisdom. In one miscellaneous section he came upon Norrie's Epitome. He turned the pages reverently. In a way, it spoke a kindred speech. Both he and it were of the sea. Then he found a Bowditch, and the books by Lecky and Marshall. There it was. He would teach himself navigation. He would quit drinking, work up, and become a captain. Ruth seemed very near to him in that moment. As a captain, he could marry her, if she would have him. And if she wouldn't, well, he would live a good life among men, because of her. And he would quit drinking anyway. Then he remembered the underwriters and the owners, the two masters a captain must serve, either of which could and would break him, and whose interests were diametrically opposed. He cast his eyes about the room and closed the lids down on a vision of 10,000 books. No more of the sea for him. There was power in that wealth of books. And if he would do great things, he must do them on the land. Besides, captains were not allowed to take their wives to sea with them. Noon came, and afternoon. He forgot to eat, and sought on for the books on etiquette, for, in addition to career, his mind was vexed by a simple and very concrete problem. When you meet a young lady, and she asks you to call, how soon can you call? Was the way he worded it to himself. But when he found the right shelf, he sought vainly for the answer. He was appalled at the vast edifice of etiquette, and lost himself in the mazes of visiting card conduct between persons in polite society. He abandoned his search. He had not found what he wanted, though he had found that it would take all of a man's time to be polite, and that he would have to live a preliminary life in which to learn how to be polite. "Did you find what you wanted?" The man at the desk asked him as he was leaving. "Yes, sir," he answered. "You have a fine library here." The man nodded. "We should be glad to see you here often. Are you a sailor?" "Yes, sir," he answered, "and I'll come again." Now, how did he know that? He asked himself as he went down the stairs. And for the first block along the street he walked very stiff and straight and awkwardly, until he forgot himself in his thoughts, whereupon his rolling gait gracefully returned to him. End of chapter 5. Chapter 6 of Martin Eden by Jack London. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Chapter 6. A terrible restlessness that was akin to hunger afflicted Martin Eden. He was famished for a sight of the girl whose slender hands had gripped his life with a giant's grasp. He could not steel himself to call upon her. He was afraid that he might call too soon, and be guilty of an awful breach of that awful thing called etiquette. He spent long hours in the Oakland and Berkeley libraries, and made out application blanks for membership for himself, his sisters Gertrude and Marion, and Jim, the latter's consent being obtained at the expense of several glasses of beer. With 4 cards permitting him to draw books, he burned the gas laid in the servants' room, and was charged 50 cents a week for it by Mr. Higginbotham. The many books he read but served to whet his unrest. Every page of every book was a peephole into the realm of knowledge. His hunger fed upon what he read, and increased. Also, he did not know where to begin, and continually suffered from lack of preparation. The commonest references, that he could see plainly every reader was expected to know, he did not know. And the same was true of the poetry he read, which maddened him with delight. He read more of Swinburne than was contained in the volume Ruth had lent him, and Dolores he understood thoroughly. But surely Ruth did not understand it, he concluded. How could she, living the refined life she did? Then he chanced upon Kipling's poems, and was swept away by the lilt and swing and glamour with which familiar things had been invested. He was amazed at the man's sympathy with life, and at his incisive psychology. Psychology was a new word in Martin's vocabulary. He had bought a dictionary, which deed had decreased his supply of money, and brought near the day on which he must sail in search of more. Also, it incensed Mr. Higginbotham, who would have preferred the money taking the form of board. He dared not go to Ruth's neighborhood in the daytime, but night found him lurking like a thief around the Morse home, stealing glimpses at the windows and loving the very walls that sheltered her. Several times he barely escaped being caught by her brothers, and once he trailed Mr. Morse downtown and studied his face in the lighted streets, longing all the while for some quick danger of death to threaten, so that he might spring in and save her father. On another night, his vigil was rewarded by a glimpse of Ruth through a second-story window. He saw only her head and shoulders, and her arms raised as she fixed her hair before a mirror. It was only for a moment, but it was a long moment to him, during which his blood turned to wine and sang through his veins. Then she had pulled down the shade. But it was her room, he had learned that, and thereafter he strayed there often, hiding under a dark tree on the opposite side of the street, and smoking countless cigarettes. One afternoon he saw her mother coming out of a bank, and received another proof of the enormous distance that separated Ruth from him. She was of the class that dealt with banks. He had never been inside a bank in his life, and he had an idea that such institutions were frequented only by the very rich and the very powerful. In one way, he had undergone a moral revolution. Her cleanness and purity had reacted upon him, and he felt in his being a crying need to be clean. He must be that if he were ever to be worthy of breathing the same air with her. He washed his teeth and scrubbed his hands with a kitchen scrub brush till he saw a nail brush in a drugstore window and divined its use. While purchasing it, the clerk glanced at his nails, suggested a nail file, and so he became possessed of an additional toilet tool. He ran across a book in the library on the care of the body, and promptly developed a penchant for a cold water bath every morning, much to the amazement of Jim, and to the bewilderment of Mr. Higginbotham, who was not in sympathy with such high-fangled notions, and who seriously debated whether or not he should charge Martin extra for the water. Another stride was in the direction of creased trousers. Now that Martin was aroused in such matters, he swiftly noted the difference between the baggy knees of the trousers worn by the working class and the straight line from knee to foot of those worn by the men above the working class. Also, he learned the reason why, and invaded his sister's kitchen in search of irons and ironing board. He had misadventures at first, hopelessly burning one pair and buying another, which expenditure again brought nearer the day on which he must put to sea. But the reform went deeper than mere outward appearance. He still smoked, but he drank no more. Up to that time, drinking had seemed to him the proper thing for men to do, and he had prided himself on his strong head, which enabled him to drink most men under the table. Whenever he encountered a chance shipmate, and there were many in San Francisco, he treated them, and was treated in turn, as of old, but he ordered for himself root beer or ginger ale, and good-naturedly endured their chaffing. And as they waxed maudlin, he studied them, watching the beast rise and master them, and thanking God that he was no longer as they. They had their limitations to forget, and when they were drunk, their dim, stupid spirits were even as gods, and each ruled in his heaven of intoxicated desire. With Martin, the need for strong drink had vanished. He was drunken in new and more profound ways, with Ruth, who had fired him with love, and with a glimpse of higher and eternal life, with books that had set a myriad maggots of desire gnawing in his brain, and with the sense of personal cleanliness he was achieving, that gave him even more superb health than what he had enjoyed, and that made his whole body sing with physical well-being. One night he went to the theater, on the blind chance that he might see her there, and from the second balcony he did see her. He saw her come down the aisle, with Arthur and a strange young man with a football mop of hair and eyeglasses, the sight of whom spurred him to instant apprehension and jealousy. He saw her take her seat in the orchestra circle, and little else than her did he see that night. A pair of slender white shoulders and a mass of pale gold hair, dim with distance. But there were others who saw, and now and again, glancing at those about him, he noted two young girls who looked back from the row in front, a dozen seats along, and who smiled at him with bold eyes. He had always been easy-going. It was not in his nature to give rebuff. In the old days he would have smiled back, and gone further and encouraged smiling. But now it was different. He did smile back, then looked away, and looked no more deliberately. But several times, forgetting the existence of the two girls, his eyes caught their smiles. He could not re-thumb himself in a day, nor could he violate the intrinsic kindliness of his nature. So, at such moments, he smiled at the girls in warm human friendliness. It was nothing new to him. He knew they were reaching out their woman's hands to him. But it was different now. Far down there in the orchestra circle was the one woman in all the world so different, so terrifically different, from these two girls of his class, that he could feel for them only pity and sorrow. He had it in his heart to wish that they could possess, in some small measure, her goodness and glory. And not for the world could he hurt them because of their outreaching. He was not flattered by it. He even felt a slight shame at his lowliness that permitted it. He knew, did he belong in Ruth's class, that there would be no overtures from these girls, and with each glance of theirs he felt the fingers of his own class clutching at him to hold him down. He left his seat before the curtain went down on the last act, intent on seeing her as she passed out. There were always numbers of men who stood on the sidewalk outside, and he could pull his cap down over his eyes and screen himself behind someone's shoulder so that she should not see him. He emerged from the theater with the first of the crowd, but scarcely had he taken his position on the edge of the sidewalk when the two girls appeared. They were looking for him, he knew, and for the moment he could have cursed that in him which drew women. Their casual edging across the sidewalk to the curb, as they drew near, apprised him of discovery. They slowed down, and were in the thick of the crowd as they came up with him. One of them brushed against him, and apparently for the first time noticed him. She was a slender, dark girl, with black, defiant eyes. But they smiled at him, and he smiled back. "Hello," he said. It was automatic. He had said it so often before, under similar circumstances of first meetings. Besides, he could do no less. There was the large tolerance and sympathy in his nature that would permit him to do no less. The black-eyed girl smiled gratification and greeting, and showed signs of stopping, while her companion, arm linked in arm, giggled and likewise showed signs of halting. He thought quickly. It would never do for her to come out and see him talking there with them. Quite naturally, as a matter of course, he swung in alongside the dark-eyed one and walked with her. There was no awkwardness on his part, no numb tongue. He was at home here, and he held his own royally in the badinage, bristling with slang and sharpness. That was always the preliminary to getting acquainted in these swift-moving affairs. At the corner where the main stream of people flowed onward, he started to edge out into the cross-street, but the girl with the black eyes caught his arm, following him and dragging her companion after her, as she cried, "Hold on, Bill, what's your rush? You're not going to shake us so sudden as all that." He halted with a laugh and turned, facing them. Across their shoulders he could see the moving throng passing under the street lamps. Where he stood it was not so light, and, unseen, he would be able to see her if she passed by. She would certainly pass by, for that way led home. "What's her name?" he asked of the giggling girl, nodding at the dark-eyed one. "You ask her," was the convulsed response. "Well, what is it?" he demanded, turning squarely on the girl in question. "You ain't told me yours yet," she retorted. "You never asked it," he smiled, Besides, you guessed the first rattle. It's Bill, all right, all right. Aw, go along with you. She looked at him in the eyes, her own sharply passionate and inviting. What is it, honest? Again she looked. All the centuries of woman since sex began were eloquent in her eyes, and he measured her in a careless way and knew, bold now, that she would begin to retreat, coyly and delicately, as he pursued, ever ready to reverse the game should he turn faint-hearted. And, too, he was human, and could feel the draw of her, while his ego could not but appreciate the flattery of her kindness. Oh, he knew it all, and knew them well, from A to Z. Good, as goodness might be, measured in their particular class, hard working for meager wages, and scorning the sale of self for easier ways, nervously desirous for some small pinch of happiness in the desert of existence, and facing a future that was a gamble between the ugliness of unending toil and the black pit of more terrible wretchedness, the way whereto being briefer, though better paid. Bill, he answered, nodding his head. Sure, Pete, Bill and no other. No joshin'? She queried. It ain't Bill at all, the other broke in. How do you know? He demanded. You never laid eyes on me before. No need to know you're lyin', was the retort. Straight, Bill, what is it? The first girl asked. Bill'll do, he confessed. She reached out to his arm and shook him playfully. I knew you was lyin', but you look good to me just the same. He captured the hand that invited, and felt on the palm familiar markings and distortions. When'd you chuck the cannery? He asked. How'd you know? And, my, ain't you a mind-reader? The girls chorused. And while he exchanged the stupidities of stupid minds with them, before his inner sight towered the bookshelves of the library, filled with the wisdom of the ages. He smiled bitterly at the incongruity of it, and was assailed by doubts. But between inner vision and outward pleasantry, he found time to watch the theater crowd streaming by. And then he saw her, under the lights, between her brother and the strange young man with glasses, and his heart seemed to stand still. He had waited long for this moment. He had time to note the light, fluffy something that hid her queenly head, the tasteful lines of her rapt figure, the gracefulness of her carriage, and of the hand that caught up her skirts. And then she was gone, and he was left staring at the two girls of the cannery, in their tawdry attempts at prettiness of dress, their tragic efforts to be clean and trim, the cheap cloth, the cheap ribbons, and the cheap rings on their fingers. He felt a tug at his arm, and heard a voice saying, Wake up, Bill. What's the matter with you? What was you sayin'? He asked. Oh, nothin', the dark girl answered, with a toss of her head. I was only remarkin'. What? Well, I was whisperin' it'd be a good idea if you could dig up a gentleman friend for her, indicating her companion. And then we could go off and have an ice cream soda somewhere, or coffee, or anything. He was afflicted by a sudden spiritual nausea. The transition from Ruth to this had been too abrupt. Ranged side to side with the bold, defiant eyes of the girl before him, he saw Ruth's clear, luminous eyes, like a saint's, gazing at him out of unplumbed depths of purity. And somehow he felt within him a stir of power. He was better than this. Life meant more to him than it meant to these two girls, whose thoughts did not go beyond ice cream and a gentleman friend. He remembered that he had led always a secret life in his thoughts. These thoughts he had tried to share, but never had he found a woman capable of understanding, nor a man. He had tried at times, but had only puzzled his listeners. And as his thoughts had been beyond them, so, he argued now, he must be beyond them. He felt power move in him, and clenched his fists. If life meant more to him, then it was for him to demand more from life. But he could not demand it from such companionship as this. Those bold black eyes had nothing to offer. He knew the thoughts behind them, of ice cream and of something else. But those saint's eyes alongside, They offered all he knew and more than he could guess. They offered books and painting, beauty and repose, and all the fine elegance of higher existence. Behind those black eyes he knew every thought process. It was like clockwork. He could watch every wheel go round. Their bid was low pleasure, narrow as the grave, that palled, and the grave was at the end of it. But the bid of the other saints' eyes was mystery, and wonderful, unthinkable, and eternal life. He had caught glimpses of the soul in them, and glimpses of his own soul too. "There's only one thing wrong with the program," he said aloud. "I've got a date already." The girl's eyes blazed with her disappointment. "To sit up with a sick friend, I suppose," she sneered. "No, a real honest date with—" he faltered, "with a girl." "You're not stringing me?" she asked earnestly. He looked her in the eyes and answered, "It's straight, all right. Why can't we meet some other time? You ain't told me your name yet, and where do you live?" "Lizzie," she replied, softening toward him, her hand pressing his arm while her body leaned against his. "Lizzie Connolly, and I live at Fifth and Market." He talked on a few minutes before saying good night. He did not go home immediately, and under the tree where he kept his vigils, he looked up at a window and murmured, "That date was with you, Ruth. I kept it for you." End of chapter 6. Chapter 7 of Martin Eden by Jack London. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Chapter 7. A week of heavy reading had passed, since the evening he first met Ruth Morse, and still he dared not call. Time and again he nerved himself up to call, but under the doubts that assailed him, his determination died away. He did not know the proper time to call, nor was there any one to tell him, and he was afraid of committing himself to an irretrievable blunder. Having shaken himself free from his old companions and old ways of life, and having no new companions, nothing remained for him but to read, and the long hours he devoted to it would have ruined a dozen pair of ordinary eyes. But his eyes were strong, and they were backed by a body superbly strong. Furthermore, his mind was fallow. It had lain fallow all his life, as far as the abstract thought of the books was concerned, and it was ripe for the sowing. It had never been jaded by study, and it bit hold of the knowledge in the books with sharp teeth that would not let go. It seemed to him, by the end of the week, that he had lived centuries, so far behind were the old life and outlook. But he was baffled by lack of preparation. He attempted to read books that required years of preliminary specialization. One day he would read a book of antiquated philosophy, and the next day one that was ultra-modern, so that his head would be whirling with the conflict and contradiction of ideas. It was the same with the economists. On the one shelf at the library he found Karl Marx, Ricardo, Adam Smith, and Mill, and the abstruse formulas of the one gave no clue that the ideas of another were obsolete. He was bewildered, and yet he wanted to know. He had become interested in a day in economics, industry, and politics. Passing through the City Hall Park, he had noticed a group of men, in the center of which were half a dozen, with flushed faces and raised voices, earnestly carrying on a discussion. He joined the listeners, and heard a new, alien tongue in the mouths of the philosophers of the people. One was a tramp, another was a labor agitator, a third was a law school student, and the remainder was composed of wordy working men. For the first time he heard of socialism, anarchism, and single tax, and learned that there were warring social philosophies. He heard hundreds of technical words that were new to him, belonging to fields of thought that his meager reading had never touched upon. Because of this he could not follow the arguments closely, and he could only guess at and surmise the ideas wrapped up in such strange expressions. Then there was a black-eyed restaurant waiter who was a theosophist, a union baker who was an agnostic, an old man who baffled all of them with the strange philosophy that what is right, and another old man who discoursed interminably about the cosmos and the father Adam and the mother Adam. Martin Eden's head was in a state of addlement when he went away after several hours, and he hurried to the library to look up the definitions of a dozen unusual words. And when he left the library, he carried under his arm 4 volumes, Madame Blavatsky's Secret Doctrine, Progress and Poverty, The Quintessence of Socialism, and Warfare of Religion and Science. Unfortunately, he began on the Secret Doctrine. Every line bristled with many-syllabled words he did not understand. He sat up in bed, and the dictionary was in front of him more often than the book. He looked up so many new words that when they recurred, he had forgotten their meaning and had to look them up again. He devised the plan of writing the definitions in a notebook, and filled page after page with them. And still he could not understand. He read until 3 in the morning, and his brain was in a turmoil, but not one essential thought in the text had he grasped. He looked up, and it seemed that the room was lifting, heeling, and plunging like a ship upon the sea. Then he hurled the Secret Doctrine and many curses across the room, turned off the gas, and composed himself to sleep. Nor did he have much better luck with the other 3 books. It was not that his brain was weak or incapable. It could think these thoughts, were it not for lack of training in thinking, and lack of thought tools with which to think. He guessed this, and for a while entertained the idea of reading nothing but the dictionary until he had mastered every word in it. Poetry, however, was his solace, and he read much of it, finding his greatest joy in the simpler poets, who were more understandable. He loved beauty, and there he found beauty. Poetry, like music, stirred him profoundly, and, though he did not know it, he was preparing his mind for the heavier work that was to come. The pages of his mind were blank, and, without effort, much he read and liked, stanza by stanza, was impressed upon those pages, so that he was soon able to extract great joy from chanting aloud or under his breath the music and the beauty of the printed words he had read. Then he stumbled upon Gailey's Classic Myths and Bulfinch's Age of Fable, side by side on a library shelf. It was illumination, a great light in the darkness of his ignorance, and he read poetry more avidly than ever. The man at the desk in the library had seen Martin there so often that he became quite cordial, always greeting him with a smile and a nod when he entered. It was because of this that Martin did a daring thing, drawing out some books at the desk, and while the man was stamping the cards, Martin blurted out, "Say, there's something I'd like to ask you." The man smiled and paid attention. "When you meet a young lady and she asks you to call, how soon can you call?" Martin felt his shirt press and cling to his shoulders, what of the sweat of the effort. "Why, I'd say any time," the man answered. "Yes, but this is different," Martin objected. Well, you see, it's this way. Maybe she won't be there. She goes to the university." "Then call again." "What I said ain't what I meant," Martin confessed falteringly, while he made up his mind to throw himself wholly upon the other's mercy. "I'm just a rough sort of fellow, and I ain't never seen anything of society. This girl is all I ain't, and I ain't anything like she is. You don't think I'm playing the fool, do you?" he demanded abruptly. "No, no, not at all, I assure you," the other protested. "Your request is not exactly in the scope of the reference department, but I shall be only too pleased to assist you." Martin looked at him admiringly. "If I could tear it off that way, I'd be all right," he said. "I beg pardon?" "I mean if I could talk easy that way, and polite and all the rest." "Oh," said the other, with comprehension. "What is the best time to call? The afternoon, not too close to mealtime? Or the evening, or Sunday?" "I'll tell you," the librarian said with a brightening face. "You call her up on the telephone and find out." "I'll do it," he said, picking up his books and starting away. He turned back and asked, "When you're speaking to a young lady, say, for instance, Miss Lizzie Smith, do you say Miss Lizzie or Miss Smith?" "Say Miss Smith," the librarian stated authoritatively. "Say Miss Smith always, until you come to know her better." So it was that Martin Eden solved the problem. "Come down any time. "I'll be at home all afternoon," was Ruth's reply over the telephone to his stammered request as to when he could return the borrowed books. She met him at the door herself, and her woman's eyes took in immediately the creased trousers and the certain slight but indefinable change in him for the better. Also, she was struck by his face. It was almost violent, this health of his, and it seemed to rush out of him and at her in waves of force. She felt the urge again of the desire to lean toward him for warmth, and marveled again at the effect his presence produced upon her. And he, in turn, knew again the swimming sensation of bliss when he felt the contact of her hand in greeting. The difference between them lay in that she was cool and self-possessed, while his face flushed to the roots of the hair. He stumbled with his old awkwardness after her, and his shoulders swung and lurched perilously. Once they were seated in the living-room, he began to get on easily, more easily by far than he had expected. She made it easy for him, and the gracious spirit with which she did it made him love her more madly than ever. They talked first of the borrowed books, of the Swinburne he was devoted to, and of the Browning he did not understand. And she led the conversation on from subject to subject, while she pondered the problem of how she could be of help to him. She had thought of this often since their first meeting. She wanted to help him. He made a call upon her pity and tenderness that no one had ever made before, and the pity was not so much derogatory of him as maternal in her. Her pity could not be of the common sort, when the man who drew it was so much man as to shock her with maidenly fears, and set her mind and pulse thrilling with strange thoughts and feelings. The old fascination of his neck was there, and there was sweetness in the thought of laying her hands upon it. It seemed still a wanton impulse, but she had grown more used to it. She did not dream that in such guise new-born love would epitomize itself, nor did she dream that the feeling he excited in her was love. She thought she was merely interested in him as an unusual type, possessing various potential excellencies, and she even felt philanthropic about it. She did not know she desired him, but with him it was different. He knew that he loved her, and he desired her as he had never before desired anything in his life. He had loved poetry for beauty's sake, and since he met her the gates to the vast field of love poetry had been opened wide. She had given him understanding even more than Bullfinch and Gayley. There was a line that a week before he would not have favored with a second thought, God's own mad lover dying on a kiss. But now it was ever insistent in his mind. He marveled at the wonder of it and the truth, and as he gazed upon her, he knew that he could die gladly upon a kiss. He felt God's own mad lover, and no accolade of knighthood could have given him greater pride. And at last he knew the meaning of life and why he was born. As he gazed at her and listened, his thoughts grew daring. He reviewed all the wild delight of the pressure of her hand in his at the door, and longed for it again. His gaze wandered often toward her lips, and he yearned for them hungrily. But there was nothing gross or earthly about this yearning. It gave him exquisite delight to watch every movement and play of those lips as they enunciated the words she spoke. Yet they were not ordinary lips, such as all men and women had. Their substance was not mere human clay. They were lips of pure spirit, and his desire for them seemed absolutely different from the desire that had led him to other women's lips. He could kiss her lips, rest his own physical lips upon them, but it would be with the lofty and awful fervor with which one would kiss the robe of God. He was not conscious of this transvaluation of values that had taken place in him, and was unaware that the light that shone in his eyes when he looked at her was quite the same light that shines in all men's eyes when the desire of love is upon them. He did not dream how ardent and masculine his gaze was, nor that the warm flame of it was affecting the alchemy of her spirit. Her penetrative virginity exalted and disguised his own emotions, elevating his thoughts to a star-cool chastity, and he would have been startled to learn that there was that shining out of his eyes like warm waves that flowed through her and kindled a kindred warmth. She was subtly perturbed by it, and more than once, though she knew not why, it disrupted her train of thought with its delicious intrusion, and compelled her to grope for the remainder of ideas partly uttered. Speech was always easy with her, and these interruptions would have puzzled her, had she not decided that it was because he was a remarkable type. She was very sensitive to impressions, and it was not strange, after all, that this aura of a traveler from another world should so affect her. The problem in the background of her consciousness was how to help him, and she turned the conversation in that direction, but it was Martin who came to the point first. "I wonder if I can get some advice from you," he began, and received an acquiescence of willingness that made his heart bound. "You remember the other time I was here, and I said I couldn't talk about books and things because I didn't know how. Well, I've been doing a lot of thinking ever since. I've been to the library a whole lot, but most of the books I've tackled have been over my head. Maybe I better begin at the beginning. I ain't never had no advantages. I've worked pretty hard ever since I was a kid, and since I've been to the library, looking with new eyes at books, and looking at new books, too, I've just about concluded that I ain't been reading the right kind. You know, the books you find in cattle camps and forecastles ain't the same you've got in this house, for instance. Well, that's the sort of reading matter I've been accustomed to, and yet, and I ain't just making a brag of it, I've been different from the people I've herded with. Not that I'm any better than the sailors and cowpunchers I traveled with. I was cowpunching for a short time, you know. But I always liked books. Read everything I could lay hands on, and well, I guess I think differently from most of 'em. Now, to come to what I'm driving at, I was never inside a house like this. When I come a week ago and saw all this and you and your mother and brothers and everything, well, I liked it. I'd heard about such things and read about such things in some of the books, and when I looked around at your house, why, the books came true. But the thing I'm after is I liked it. I wanted it. I want it now. I want to breathe air like you get in this house, air that is filled with books and pictures and beautiful things, where people talk in low voices and are clean, and their thoughts are clean. The air I always breathed was mixed up with grub and house rent and scrapping and booze, and that's all they talked about, too. Why, when you was crossing the room to kiss your mother, I thought it was the most beautiful thing I ever seen. I've seen a whole lot of life, and somehow I've seen a whole lot more of it than most of them that was with me. I like to see, and I want to see more, and I want to see it different. But I ain't got to the point yet. Here it is. I want to make my way to the kind of life you have in this house. There's more in life than booze and hard work and knocking about. Now, how am I going to get it? Where do I take hold and begin? I'm willing to work my passage, you know, and I can make most men sick when it comes to hard work. Once I get started, I'll work day and night. Maybe you think it's funny me asking you about all this. I know you're the last person in the world I ought to ask, but I don't know anybody else I could ask, unless it's Arthur. Maybe I ought to ask him. If I was—" His voice died away. His firmly planned intention had come to a halt, on the verge of the horrible probability that he should have asked Arthur, and that he had made a fool of himself. Ruth did not speak immediately. She was too absorbed in striving to reconcile the stumbling, uncouth speech and its simplicity of thought with what she saw in his face. She had never looked in eyes that expressed greater power. Here was a man who could do anything, was the message she read there, and it accorded ill with the weakness of his spoken thought. And, for that matter, so complex and quick was her own mind that she did not have a just appreciation of simplicity. And yet she had caught an impression of power in the very groping of this mind. It had seemed to her like a giant writhing and straining at the bonds that held him down. Her face was all sympathy when she did speak. What you need, you realize yourself, and it is education. You should go back and finish grammar school, and then go through to high school and university. But that takes money, he interrupted. Oh, she cried, I had not thought of that. But then you have relatives, somebody who could assist you. He shook his head. My father and mother are dead. I've two sisters, one married, and the other one'll get married soon, I suppose. Then I've a string of brothers. I'm the youngest. But they never help nobody. They've just knocked around the world, looking out for number one. The oldest died in India. Two are in South Africa now, and another's on a whaling voyage, and one's traveling with a circus. He does trapeze work. And I guess I'm just like them. I've taken care of myself since I was 11. That's when my mother died. I've got to study by myself, I guess, and what I want to know is where to begin. I should say the first thing of all would be to get a grammar. Your grammar is—" she had intended saying awful, but she amended it to "is not particularly good." He flushed and sweated. "I know I must talk a lot of slang and words you don't understand, but then they're the only words I know how to speak. I've got other words in my mind, picked 'em up from books, but I can't pronounce 'em, so I don't use 'em." "It isn't what you say, so much as how you say it. You don't mind my being frank, do you? I don't want to hurt you." "No, no," he cried, while he secretly blessed her for kindness. "Fire away. I've got to know, and I'd sooner know from you than from anybody else." "Well, then, you say, 'you was.' It should be, 'you were.' You say, 'I seen for I saw.' You use the double negative." "What's the double negative?" he demanded, then added humbly, "You see, I don't even understand your explanations." "I'm afraid I didn't explain that," she smiled. "A double negative is, let me see. Well, you say never help nobody. Never is a negative. Nobody is another negative. It is a rule that two negatives make a positive. Never help nobody means that, not helping nobody, they must have helped somebody." "That's pretty clear," he said. "I never thought of it before. But it don't mean they must have helped somebody, does it? Seems to me that never help nobody just naturally fails to say whether or not they help somebody. I never thought of it before, and I'll never say it again." She was pleased and surprised with the quickness and surety of his mind. As soon as he had got the clue, he not only understood, but corrected her error. "You'll find it all in the grammar," she went on. "There's something else I noticed in your speech. You say don't when you shouldn't. Don't is a contraction and stands for two words. Do you know them?" He thought a moment, then answered, "Do not." She nodded her head and said, "And you use don't when you mean does not." He was puzzled over this and did not get it so quickly. "Give me an illustration," he said. "Well—" She puckered her brows and pursed up her mouth as she thought, while he looked on and decided that her expression was most adorable. "It don't do to be hasty. Change don't to do not, and it reads, 'It do not do to be hasty,' which is perfectly absurd." He turned it over in his mind and considered. "Doesn't it jar on your ear?" she suggested. "Can't say that it does," he replied judicially. "Why didn't you say, 'Can't say that it do'?" she queried. "That sounds wrong," he said slowly. "As for the other, I can't make up my mind. I guess my ear ain't had the training yours has." "There is no such word as ain't," she said, prettily emphatic. Martin flushed again. "And you say been for been," she continued. "Come for came, and the way you chop your endings is something dreadful." "How do you mean?" He leaned forward, feeling that he ought to get down on his knees before so marvelous a mind. "How do I chop?" "You don't complete the endings. A-N-D spells and. You pronounce it an. I-N-G spells ing. Sometimes you pronounce it ing, and sometimes you leave off the G. And then you slur by dropping initial letters and diphthongs. T-H-E-M spells them. You pronounce it. Oh well, it is not necessary to go over all of them. What you need is the grammar. I'll get you one, and show you how to begin." As she arose, there shot through his mind something that he had read in the etiquette books, and he stood up awkwardly, worrying as to whether he was doing the right thing, and fearing that she might take it as a sign that he was about to go. "By the way, Mr. Eden," she called back, as she was leaving the room, "what is booze? You used it several times, you know." "Oh, booze!" he laughed. "It's slang. It means whiskey and beer, anything that will make you drunk. And another thing," she laughed back. "Don't use you when you are impersonal. You is very personal, and your use of it just now was not precisely what you meant." "I don't see just that." "Why, you said just now to me, whiskey and beer, anything that will make you drunk. Make me drunk, don't you see?" "Well, it would, wouldn't it?" "Yes, of course," she smiled. "But it would be nicer not to bring me into it. Substitute one for you, and see how much better it sounds." When she returned with the grammar, she drew a chair near his. He wondered if he should have helped her with the chair, and sat down beside him. She turned the pages of the grammar, and their heads were inclined toward each other. He could hardly follow her outlining of the work he must do. So amazed was he by her delightful propinquity. Just when she began to lay down the importance of conjugation, he forgot all about her. He had never heard of conjugation, and was fascinated by the glimpse he was catching into the tie-ribs of language. He leaned closer to the page, and her hair touched his cheek. He had fainted but once in his life, and he thought he was going to faint again. He could scarcely breathe, and his heart was pounding the blood up into his throat and suffocating him. Never had she seemed so accessible as now. For the moment the great gulf that separated them was bridged. But there was no diminution in the loftiness of his feeling for her. She had not descended to him. It was he who had been caught up into the clouds and carried to her. His reverence for her, in that moment, was of the same order as religious awe and fervor. It seemed to him that he had intruded upon the Holy of Holies, and slowly and carefully he moved his head aside from the contact which thrilled him like an electric shock, and of which she had not been aware. End of chapter 7. Chapter 8 of Martin Eden by Jack London. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Chapter 8. Several weeks went by, during which Martin Eden studied his grammar, reviewed the books on etiquette, and read voraciously the books that caught his fancy. Of his own class he saw nothing. The girls of the Lotus Club wondered what had become of him, and worried Jim with questions. And some of the fellows who put on the glove at Riley's were glad that Martin came no more. He made another discovery of treasure trove in the library. As the grammar had shown him the tie-ribs of language, so that book showed him the tie-ribs of poetry, and he began to learn meter and construction and form. Beneath the beauty he loved finding the why and wherefore of that beauty. Another modern book he found treated poetry as a representative art, treated it exhaustively, with copious illustrations from the best in literature. Never had he read fiction with so keen zest as he studied these books, and his fresh mind, untaxed for 20 years, and impelled by maturity of desire, gripped hold of what he read with a virility unusual to the student mind. When he looked back now from his vantage ground, the old world he had known, the world of land and sea and ships, of sailor-men and harpy women, seemed a very small world. And yet it blended in with this new world and expanded. His mind made for unity, and he was surprised when at first he began to see points of contact between the two worlds. And he was ennobled as well by the loftiness of thought and beauty he found in the books. This led him to believe more firmly than ever that up above, in society like Ruth and her family, all men and women thought these thoughts and lived them. Down below where he lived was the ignoble, and he wanted to purge himself of the ignoble that had soiled all his days, and to rise to that sublimated realm where dwelt the upper classes. All his childhood and youth had been troubled by a vague unrest. He had never known what he wanted, but he had wanted something that he had hunted vainly for until he met Ruth. And now this unrest had become sharp and painful, and he knew at last, clearly and definitely, that it was beauty and intellect and love that he must have. During those several weeks he saw Ruth half a dozen times, and each time was an added inspiration. She helped him with his English, corrected his pronunciation, and started him on arithmetic. But their intercourse was not all devoted to elementary study. He had seen too much of life, and his mind was too matured to be wholly content with fractions, cube root, parsing, and analysis, and there were times when their conversation turned on other themes, the last poetry he had read, the latest poet she had studied. And when she read aloud to him her favorite passages, he ascended to the topmost heaven of delight. Never, in all the women he had heard speak, had he heard a voice like hers. The least sound of it was a stimulus to his love, and he thrilled and throbbed with every word she uttered. It was the quality of it, the repose, and the musical modulation, the soft, rich, indefinable product of culture and a gentle soul. As he listened to her, there rang in his ears of his memory the harsh cries of barbarian women and of hags, and, in lesser degrees of harshness, the strident voices of working women and of the girls of his own class. Then the chemistry of vision would begin to work, and they would troop in view across his mind, each by contrast, multiplying Ruth's glories. Then, too, his bliss was heightened by the knowledge that her mind was comprehending what she read, and was quivering with appreciation of the beauty of the written thought. She read to him much of the princess, and often he saw her eyes swimming with tears, so finely was her aesthetic nature strung. At such moments her own emotions elevated him till he was as a god, and, as he gazed at her and listened, he seemed gazing on the face of life and reading its deepest secrets. And then, becoming aware of the heights of exquisite sensibility he attained, he decided that this was love, and that love was the greatest thing in the world. And in review would pass along the corridors of memory all previous thrills and burnings he had known, the drunkenness of wine, the caresses of women, the rough play and give and take of physical contests, and they seemed trivial and mean compared with this sublime ardor he now enjoyed. The situation was obscured to Ruth. She had never had any experiences of the heart. Her only experiences in such matters were of the books, where the facts of ordinary day were translated by fancy into a fairy realm of unreality. And she little knew that this rough sailor was creeping into her heart and storing there pent forces that would some day burst forth and surge through her in waves of fire. She did not know the actual fire of love. Her knowledge of love was purely theoretical, and she conceived of it as lambent flame, gentle as the fall of dew or the ripple of quiet water, and cool as the velvet dark of summer nights. Her idea of love was more that of placid affection, serving the loved one softly in an atmosphere, flower-scented and dim-lighted, of ethereal calm. She did not dream of the volcanic convulsions of love, its scorching heat and sterile wastes of parched ashes. She knew neither her own potencies nor the potencies of the world, and the deeps of life were to her seas of illusion. The conjugal affection of her father and mother constituted her ideal of love affinity, and she looked forward some day to emerging, without shock or friction, into that same quiet sweetness of existence with a loved one. So it was that she looked upon Martin Eden as a novelty, a strange individual, and she identified with novelty and strangeness the effects he produced upon her. It was only natural. In similar ways, she had experienced unusual feelings when she looked at wild animals in the menagerie, or when she witnessed a storm of wind, or shuddered at the bright-ribbed lightning. There was something cosmic in such things, and there was something cosmic in him. He came to her breathing of large airs and great spaces. The blaze of tropic suns was in his face, and in his swelling, resilient muscles was the primordial vigor of life. He was marred and scarred by that mysterious world of rough men and rougher deeds, the outposts of which began beyond her horizon. He was untamed, wild, and in secret ways her vanity was touched by the fact that he came so mildly to her hand. Likewise, she was stirred by the common impulse to tame the wild thing. It was an unconscious impulse, and farthest from her thoughts that her desire was to rethumb the clay of him into a likeness of her father's image, which image she believed to be the finest in the world. Nor was there any way, out of her inexperience, for her to know that the cosmic feel she caught of him was that most cosmic of things, love, which with equal power drew men and women together across the world, compelled stags to kill each other in the rutting season, and drove even the elements irresistibly to unite. His swift development was a source of surprise and interest. She detected unguessed finenesses in him that seemed to bud day by day, like flowers in congenial soil. She read Browning aloud to him, and was often puzzled by the strange interpretations he gave to mooted passages. It was beyond her to realize that, out of his experience of men and women and life, his interpretations were far more frequently correct than hers. His conception seemed naive to her, though she was often fired by his daring flights of comprehension, whose orbit path was so wide among the stars that she could not follow, and could only sit and thrill to the impact of unguessed power. Then she played to him, no longer at him, and probed him with music that sank to depths beyond her plumb line. His nature opened to music as a flower to the sun, and the transition was quick from his working-class ragtime and jingles to her classical display pieces that she knew nearly by heart. Yet he betrayed a democratic fondness for Wagner, and the Tannhauser overture, when she had given him the clue to it, claimed him as nothing else she played. In an immediate way it personified his life. All his past was the Venusberg motif, while her he identified somehow with the Pilgrim's Chorus motif, and from the exalted state this elevated him to, he swept onward and upward, into that vast shadow realm of spirit groping, where good and evil war eternally. Sometimes he questioned, and induced in her mild temporary doubts as to the correctness of her own definitions and conceptions of music. But her singing he did not question. It was too wholly her, and he sat always amazed at the divine melody of her pure soprano voice. And he could not help but contrast it with the weak pipings and shrill quaverings of factory girls. Ill-nourished and untrained, and with the raucous shriekings from gin-cracked throats of the women of the seaport towns, she enjoyed singing and playing to him. In truth, it was the first time she had ever had a human soul to play with, and the plastic clay of him was a delight to mold. For she thought she was molding it, and her intentions were good. Besides, it was pleasant to be with him. He did not repel her. That first repulsion had been really a fear of her undiscovered self, and the fear had gone to sleep. Though she did not know it, she had a feeling in him of proprietary right. Also, he had a tonic effect upon her. She was studying hard at the university, and it seemed to strengthen her to emerge from the dusty books and have a fresh sea breeze of his personality blow upon her. Strength. Strength was what she needed, and he gave it to her in generous measure. To come into the same room with him, or to meet him at the door, was to take heart of life. And when he had gone, she would return to her books with a keener zest and fresh store of energy. She knew her Browning, but it had never sunk into her that it was an awkward thing to play with souls. As her interest in Martin increased, the remodeling of his life became a passion with her. "There is Mr. Butler," she said one afternoon, when grammar and arithmetic and poetry had been put aside. He had comparatively no advantages at first. His father had been a bank cashier, and he lingered for years, dying of consumption in Arizona, so that when he was dead, Mr. Butler, Charles Butler, he was called, found himself alone in the world. His father had come from Australia, you know, and so he had no relatives in California. He went to work in a printing office. I have heard him tell of it many times, and he got $3 a week at first. His income today is at least $30,000 a year. How did he do it? He was honest and faithful and industrious and economical. He denied himself the enjoyments that most boys indulge in. He made it a point to save so much every week, no matter what he had to do without in order to save it. Of course, he was soon earning more than $3 a week, and as his wages increased he saved more and more. He worked in the daytime, and at night he went to night school. He had his eyes fixed always on the future. Later on he went to night high school, When he was only 17, he was earning excellent wages at setting type, but he was ambitious. He wanted a career, not a livelihood, and he was content to make immediate sacrifices for his ultimate gain. He decided upon the law, and entered father's office as an office boy. Think of that, and got only $4 a week. But he had learned how to be economical, and out of that $4 he went on saving money. She paused for breath, and to note how Martin was receiving it. His face was lighted up with interest in the youthful struggles of Mr. Butler, but there was a frown upon his face as well. "I'd say they was pretty hard times for a young fellow," he remarked. $4 a week! How could he live on it? You can bet he didn't have any frills. Why, I pay $5 a week for board now, and there's nothing exciting about it, you can lay to that. He must have lived like a dog. The food he ate! He cooked for himself," she interrupted, "on a little kerosene stove." "The food he ate must have been worse than what a sailor gets on the worst feedin' deep-water ships, than which there ain't much that can be possibly worse." "But think of him now," she cried enthusiastically. "Think of what his income affords him. His early denials are paid for 1,000-fold." Martin looked at her sharply. "There's one thing I'll bet you," he said, "and it is that Mr. Butler is nothing gay-hearted now in his fat days. He fed himself like that for years and years on a boy's stomach, and I bet his stomach's none too good now for it." Her eyes dropped before his searching gaze. "I'll bet he's got dyspepsia right now," Martin challenged. "Yes, he has," she confessed, "but—" "And I bet," Martin dashed on, "that he's solemn and serious as an old owl, and doesn't care a rap for a good time, for all his 30,000 a year. And I bet he's not particularly joyful at seeing others have a good time. Ain't I right?" She nodded her head in agreement, and hastened to explain. "But he is not that kind of man. By nature he is sober and serious. He always was that." "You can bet he was," Martin proclaimed. $3 a week and $4 a week, and a young boy cooking for himself on an oil burner and laying up money, working all day and studying all night, just working and never playing, never having a good time, and never learning how to have a good time. Of course his 30,000 came along too late." His sympathetic imagination was flashing upon his inner sight of all the thousands of details of the boy's existence, and of his narrow spiritual development into a $30,000 a year man. With the swiftness and wide-reaching of multitudinous thought, Charles Butler's whole life was telescoped upon his vision. "Do you know," he added, "I feel sorry for Mr. Butler. He was too young to know better, but he robbed himself of life for the sake of 30,000 a year that's clean wasted upon him. Why, 30,000 lump sum wouldn't buy for him right now what 10 cents he was layin' up would have bought him when he was a kid, in the way of candy and peanuts, or a seat in nigger heaven." It was just such uniqueness of points of view that startled Ruth. Not only were they new to her, and contrary to her own beliefs, but she always felt in them germs of truth that threatened to unseat or modify her own convictions. Had she been 14 instead of 24, she might have been changed by them, but she was 24, conservative by nature and upbringing, and already crystallized into the cranny of life where she had been born and formed. It was true, his bizarre judgments troubled her in the moments when they were uttered, but she ascribed them to his novelty of type and strangeness of living, and they were soon forgotten. Nevertheless, while she disapproved of them, the strength of their utterance and the flashing eyes and earnestness of face that accompanied them always thrilled her and drew her toward him. She would never have guessed that this man, who had come from beyond her horizon, was, in such moments, flashing on beyond her horizon with wider and deeper concepts. Her own limits were the limits of her horizon, but limited minds can recognize limitations only in others, and so she felt that her outlook was very wide indeed, and that where his conflicted with hers marked his limitations, and she dreamed of helping him to see as she saw, of widening his horizon until it was identified with hers. "But I have not finished my story," she said. "He worked, so father says, as no other office boy he ever had. Mr. Butler was always eager to work. He was never late, and he was usually in the office a few minutes before his regular time. And yet he saved his time. Every spare moment was devoted to study. He studied bookkeeping and typewriting, and he paid for lessons in shorthand by dictating at night to a court reporter who needed practice. He quickly became a clerk, and he made himself invaluable. Father appreciated him and saw that he was bound to rise. It was on Father's suggestion that he went to law college. He became a lawyer, and hardly was he back in the office when Father took him in as junior partner. He is a great man. He refused the United States Senate several times, and Father says he could become a justice of the Supreme Court any time a vacancy occurs, if he wants to. Such a life is an inspiration to all of us. It shows us that a man with will may rise superior to his environment. He is a great man, Martin said sincerely. But it seemed to him that there was something in the recital that jarred upon his sense of beauty and life. He did not find an adequate motive in Mr. Butler's life of pinching and privation. Had he done it for love of a woman, or for attainment of beauty, Martin would have understood. God's own mad lover should do anything for the kiss, but not for $30,000 a year. He was dissatisfied with Mr. Butler's career. There was something paltry about it, after all. $30,000 a year was all right, but dyspepsia and inability to be humanly happy robbed such a princely income of all its value. Much of this he strove to express to Ruth, and shocked her and made it clear that more remodeling was necessary. Hers was that common insularity of mind that makes human creatures believe that their color, creed, and politics are best and right, and that other human creatures scattered over the world are less fortunately placed than they. It was the same insularity of mind that made the ancient Jew thank God he was not born a woman, and sent the modern missionary God-substituting to the ends of the earth. And it made Ruth desire to shape this man from the other crannies of life into the likeness of the men who lived in her particular cranny of life. End of chapter 8. Chapter 9 of Martin Eden by Jack London. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Chapter 9. Back from sea Martin came, homing for California with a lover's desire. The store of money exhausted, he had shipped before the mast on the treasure-hunting schooner, and the Solomon Islands, after 8 months of failure to find treasure, had witnessed the breaking up of the expedition. The men had been paid off in Australia, and Martin immediately shipped on a deep-water vessel for San Francisco. Not alone had those 8 months earned him enough money to stay on land for many weeks, but they had enabled him to do a great deal of studying and reading. His was the student's mind, and behind his ability to learn was the indomitability of his nature and his love for Ruth. The grammar he had taken along he went through again and again until his unjaded brain had mastered it. He noticed the bad grammar used by his shipmates, and made a point of mentally correcting and reconstructing their crudities of speech. To his great joy he discovered that his ear was becoming sensitive, and that he was developing grammatical nerves. A double negative jarred him like a discord, and often, from lack of practice, it was from his own lips that the jar came. His tongue refused to learn new tricks in a day. After he had been through the grammar repeatedly, he took up the dictionary and added 20 words a day to his vocabulary. He found that this was no light task, and at wheel or lookout he steadily went over and over his lengthening list of pronunciations and definitions, while he invariably memorized himself to sleep. Never did anything, if I were, and those things were phrases with many variations that he repeated under his breath in order to accustom his tongue to the language spoken by Ruth. And ing, with the D and G pronounced emphatically, he went over thousands of times, and to his surprise he noticed that he was beginning to speak cleaner and more correct English than the officers themselves and the gentlemen adventurers in the cabin who had financed the expedition. The captain was a fishy-eyed Norwegian who somehow had fallen into possession of a complete Shakespeare which he never read, and Martin had washed his clothes for him and in return been permitted access to the precious volumes. For a time, so steeped was he in the plays and in the many favorite passages that impressed themselves almost without effort on his brain, that all the world seemed to shape itself into forms of Elizabethan tragedy or comedy, and his very thoughts were in blank verse. It trained his ear and gave him a fine appreciation for noble English. Withal it introduced into his mind much that was archaic and obsolete. The 8 months had been well spent, and, in addition to what he learned of right speaking and high thinking, he had learned much of himself. Along with his humbleness because he knew so little, there arose a conviction of power. He felt a sharp gradation between himself and his shipmates, and was wise enough to realize that the difference lay in potentiality rather than achievement. What he could do, they could do, but within him he felt a confused ferment working that told him there was more in him than he had done. He was tortured by the exquisite beauty of the world, and wished that Ruth were there to share it with him. He decided that he would describe to her many of the bits of South Sea beauty. The creative spirit in him flamed up at the thought, and urged that he recreate this beauty for a wider audience than Ruth. And then, in splendor and glory, came the great idea. He would write. He would be one of the eyes through which the world saw, one of the ears through which it heard, one of the hearts through which it felt. He would write everything, poetry and prose, fiction and description, and plays like Shakespeare. There was career and the way to win Ruth. The men of literature were the world's giants, and he conceived them to be far finer than the Mr. Butlers who earned 30,000 a year, and could be Supreme Court justices if they wanted to. Once the idea had germinated, it mastered him, and the return voyage to San Francisco was like a dream. He was drunken with unguessed power, and felt he could do anything. In the midst of the great and lonely sea he gained perspective. Clearly, and for the first time, he saw Ruth and her world. It was all visualized in his mind as a concrete thing, which he could take up in his 2 hands and turn around and about and examine. There was much that was dim and nebulous in that world, but he saw it as a whole and not in detail, and he saw also the way to master it, to write. The thought was fire in him. He would begin as soon as he got back. The first thing he would do would be to describe the voyage of the treasure hunters. He would sell it to some San Francisco newspaper. He would not tell Ruth anything about it, and she would be surprised and pleased when she saw his name in print. While he wrote, he would go on studying. There were 24 hours in each day. He was invincible. He knew how to work, and the citadels would go down before him. He would not have to go to sea again, as a sailor. And for the instant he caught a vision of a steam yacht. There were other writers who possessed steam yachts. Of course, he cautioned himself, it would be slow succeeding at first, and for a time he would be content to earn enough money by his writing to enable him to go on studying. And then, after some time, a very indeterminate time, when he had learned and prepared himself, he would write the great things, and his name would be on all men's lips. But greater than that, infinitely greater and greatest of all, he would have proved himself worthy of Ruth. Fame was all very well, but it was for Ruth that his splendid dream arose. He was not a fame-monger, but merely one of God's mad lovers. Arrived in Oakland, with his snug payday in his pocket, he took up his old room at Bernard Higginbotham's and set to work. He did not even let Ruth know he was back. He would go and see her when he finished the article on the treasure hunters. It was not so difficult to abstain from seeing her, because of the violent heat of creative fever that burned in him. Besides, the very article he was writing would bring her nearer to him. He did not know how long an article he should write, but he counted the words in a double-page article in the Sunday supplement of the San Francisco Examiner, and guided himself by that. 3 days at white heat completed his narrative, but when he had copied it carefully in a large scrawl that was easy to read, he learned from a rhetoric he had picked up in the library that there were such things as paragraphs and quotation marks. He had never thought of such things before, and he promptly set to work writing the article over, referring continually to the pages of the rhetoric, and learning more in a day about composition than the average schoolboy in a year. When he had copied the article a second time and rolled it up carefully, he read in a newspaper an item on hints to beginners, and discovered the iron law that manuscripts should never be rolled and that they should be written on one side of the paper. He had violated the law on both counts. Also, he learned from the item that first-class papers paid a minimum of $10 a column. So, while he copied the manuscript a third time, he consoled himself by multiplying 10 columns by $10. The product was always the same, $100, and he decided that that was better than seafaring. If it hadn't been for his blunders, he would have finished the article in 3 days. $100 in 3 days. It would have taken him 3 months and longer on the sea to earn a similar amount. A man was a fool to go to sea when he could write, he concluded, though the money in itself meant nothing to him. Its value was in the liberty it would get him, the presentable garments it would buy him, all of which would bring him nearer, swiftly nearer, to the slender, pale girl who had turned his life back upon itself and given him inspiration. He mailed the manuscript in a flat envelope and addressed it to the editor of the San Francisco Examiner. He had an idea that anything accepted by a paper was published immediately, and as he had sent the manuscript in on Friday, he expected it to come out the following Sunday. He conceived that it would be fine to let that event apprise Ruth of his return. Then, Sunday afternoon, he would call and see her. In the meantime, he was occupied by another idea, which he prided himself upon as being a particularly sane, careful, and modest idea. He would write an adventure story for boys and sell it to the Youth's Companion. He went to the free reading room and looked through the files of the Youth's Companion. Serial stories, he found, were usually published in that weekly in 5 installments of about 3,000 words each. He discovered several serials that ran to 7 installments, and decided to write one of that length. He had been on a whaling voyage in the Arctic once, a voyage that was to have been for 3 years, and which had terminated in shipwreck at the end of 6 months. While his imagination was fanciful, even fantastic at times, he had a basic love of reality that compelled him to write about the things he knew. He knew whaling, and out of the real materials of his knowledge, he proceeded to manufacture the fictitious adventures of the 2 boys he intended to use as joint heroes. It was easy work, he decided on Saturday evening. He had completed on that day the first installment of 3,000 words, much to the amusement of Jim, and to the open derision of Mr. Higginbotham, who sneered throughout mealtime at the literary person they had discovered in the family. Martin contented himself by picturing his brother-in-law's surprise on Sunday morning when he opened his Examiner and saw the article on the treasure hunters. Early that morning he was out himself to the front door, nervously racing through the many-sheeted newspaper. He went through it a second time, very carefully, then folded it up and left it where he had found it. He was glad he had not told anyone about his article. On second thought, he concluded that he had been wrong about the speed with which things found their way into newspaper columns. Besides, there had not been any news value in his article, and most likely the editor would write to him about it first. After breakfast he went on with his serial. The words flowed from his pen, though he broke off from the writing frequently to look up definitions in the dictionary or to refer to the rhetoric. He often read or reread a chapter at a time, during such pauses, and he consoled himself that while he was not writing the great things he felt to be in him, he was learning composition, at any rate, and training himself to shape up and express his thoughts. He toiled on till dark, when he went out to the reading room and explored magazines and weeklies until the place closed at 10 o'clock. This was his program for a week. Each day he did 3,000 words, and each evening he puzzled his way through the magazines, taking note of the stories, articles, and poems that editors saw fit to publish. One thing was certain. What these multitudinous writers did he could do, and only give him time, and he would do what they could not do. He was cheered to read in Book News, in a paragraph on the payment of magazine writers, not that Rudyard Kipling received $1 per word, but that the minimum rate paid by first-class magazines was 2 cents a word. The Youth's Companion was certainly first class, and at that rate the 3,000 words he had written that day would bring him $60, 2 months' wages on the sea. On Friday night he finished the serial, 21,000 words long. At 2 cents a word, he calculated, that would bring him $420, not a bad week's work. It was more money than he had ever possessed at one time. He did not know how he could spend it all. He had tapped a gold mine. Where this came from, he could always get more. He planned to buy some more clothes, to subscribe to many magazines, and to buy dozens of reference books that at present he was compelled to go to the library to consult. And still there was a large portion of the $420 unspent. This worried him until the thought came to him of hiring a servant for Gertrude and of buying a bicycle for Marion. He mailed the bulky manuscript to the Youth's Companion, and on Saturday afternoon, after having planned an article on pearl diving, he went to see Ruth. He had telephoned, and she went herself to greet him at the door. The old familiar blaze of health rushed out from him and struck her like a blow. It seemed to enter into her body and course through her veins in a liquid glow, and to set her quivering with its imparted strength. He flushed warmly as he took her hand and looked into her blue eyes, but the fresh bronze of 8 months of sun hid the flush, though it did not protect the neck from the gnawing chafe of the stiff collar. She noted the red line of it with amusement, which quickly vanished as she glanced at his clothes. They really fitted him. It was his first made-to-order suit, and he seemed slimmer and better modeled. In addition, his cloth cap had been replaced by a soft hat, which she commanded him to put on, and then complimented him on his appearance. She did not remember when she had felt so happy. This change in him was her handiwork, and she was proud of it and fired with ambition further to help him. But the most radical change of all, and the one that pleased her most, was the change in his speech. Not only did he speak more correctly, but he spoke more easily, and there were many new words in his vocabulary. When he grew excited or enthusiastic, however, he dropped back into the old slurring and the dropping of final consonants. Also, there was an awkward hesitancy at times, as he essayed the new words he had learned. On the other hand, along with his ease of expression, he displayed a lightness and facetiousness of thought that delighted her. It was his old spirit of humor and badinage that had made him a favorite in his own class, but which he had hitherto been unable to use in her presence through lack of words and training. He was just beginning to orientate himself, and to feel that he was not wholly an intruder. But he was very tentative, fastidiously so, letting Ruth set the pace of sprightliness and fancy, keeping up with her, but never daring to go beyond her. He told her of what he had been doing, and of his plan to write for a livelihood, and of going on with his studies. But he was disappointed at her lack of approval. She did not think much of his plan. "You see," she said frankly, "writing must be a trade like anything else. Not that I know anything about it, of course. I only bring common judgment to bear. You couldn't hope to be a blacksmith without spending 3 years at learning the trade. Or is it 5 years? Now writers are so much better paid than blacksmiths that there must be ever so many more men who would like to write, who try to write. But then, may I not be peculiarly constituted to write?" he queried, secretly exulting at the language he had used, his swift imagination throwing the whole scene and atmosphere upon a vast screen, along with 1,000 other scenes from his life, scenes that were rough and raw, gross and bestial. The whole composite vision was achieved with the speed of light, producing no pause in the conversation, nor interrupting his calm train of thought. On the train of his imagination he saw himself and this sweet and beautiful girl, facing each other and conversing in good English, in a room full of books and paintings and tone and culture, and all illuminated by a bright light of steadfast brilliance, while ranged about and fading away to the remote edges of the screen were antithetical scenes, each scene a picture, and he the onlooker, free to look at will upon what he wished. He saw these other scenes through drifting vapors and swirls of sullen fog, dissolving before shafts of red and garish light. He saw cowboys at the bar, drinking fierce whiskey, the air filled with obscenity and ribald language, and he saw himself with them drinking and cursing with the wildest, or sitting at table with them, under smoking kerosene lamps, while the chips clicked and clattered, and the cards were dealt around. He saw himself stripped to the waist, with naked fists, fighting his great fight with Liverpool Red in the forecastle of the Susquehanna, and he saw the bloody deck of the John Rogers, that gray morning of attempted mutiny, the mate kicking in death throes on the main hatch, the revolver in the old man's hand spitting fire and smoke, the men with passion-wrenched faces, of brutes screaming vile blasphemies and falling about him. And then he returned to the central scene, calm and clean in the steadfast light, where Ruth sat and talked with him amid books and paintings, and he saw the grand piano upon which she would play later to him, and he heard the echoes of his own selected and correct words. But then, may I not be peculiarly constituted to write? But no matter how peculiarly constituted a man may be for blacksmithing, she was laughing. I never heard of one becoming a blacksmith without first serving his apprenticeship. What would you advise? He asked. And don't forget that I feel in me this capacity to write. I can't explain it. I just know that it is in me. You must get a thorough education, was the answer, whether or not you ultimately become a writer. This education is indispensable for whatever career you select, and it must not be slipshod or sketchy. You must go to high school. Yes, he began, but she interrupted him with an afterthought. Of course you could go on with your writing, too. I would have to, he said grimly. Why? She looked at him, prettily puzzled, for she did not quite like the persistence with which he clung to his notion. Because, without writing, there wouldn't be any high school. I must live and buy books and clothes, you know. I'd forgotten that, she laughed. Why weren't you born with an income? I'd rather have good health and imagination, he answered. I can make good on the income, but the other things have to be made good for. He almost said you, then amended his sentence too. Have to be made good for one. Don't say make good, she cried, sweetly petulant. It's slang, and it's horrid. He flushed and stammered. That's right, and I only wish you'd correct me every time. I'd like to, she said haltingly. You have so much in you that is good that I want to see you perfect. He was clay in her hands immediately, as passionately desirous of being molded by her as she was desirous of shaping him into the image of her ideal of man. And when she pointed out the opportuneness of the time, that the entrance examinations to high school began on the following Monday, he promptly volunteered that he would take them. Then she played and sang to him, while he gazed at hungry yearning at her, drinking in her loveliness, and marveling that there should not be 100 suitors listening there, and longing for her as he listened and longed. End of chapter 9.